The clear autumn sky and the warm wind played with the ears of wheat in the wheat field, yet they were not supposed to meet that day. But fate decreed otherwise while the young lady was wandering through the human world. She understood that this world was very boring compared to the demonic realm. She was the youngest of the 7 lords of the demon realm, Astaroth, the demon of death and war. She knew she shouldn't trust anyone in the human world, but she saw that everyone was boring and unremarkable, so she wondered what she had to be afraid of. A moment later, all her thoughts vanished as she saw a man chasing his hat. When she saw a young man who was looking at her with a smile, because she caught his hat, he smiled and thanked her for doing so. She was taken aback and said that he should say his name, and the young man sheepishly asked what she was talking about. She came closer to him and said that she wanted to know his name. The young man was confused by this, but at the same moment, he declared that his name was Enrique. Enrique thanked her again for catching his hat, but then he declared that it was time for him to go. For some time, the lady stared after him, but a moment later, she whispered his name again. That day, forgetting her sister's warnings, she fell head over heels in love with the naive shepherd. The next day, she greeted him with a smile, and the young man was surprised to see her. He greeted her with a smile, and Enrique asked what brought her to him. Astaroth calmly stated that she fell in love with him at first sight. Enrique was very embarrassed, because he did not expect this. Astaroth introduced herself and said with a smile that she would soon become his lover, so he should remember her name. The young man couldn't resist and burst out laughing at that very moment, as it was the first time someone had confessed their feelings to him so openly. Astaroth understood that she had done a strange thing, because she was not human at all. Enrique calmed down and stated that he hardly knew her, but moments later he declared with a smile that a family of love for her had already been born in his heart long ago. The more she fell in love with him, the more impatient she became. She knew that compared to her, the immortal, his life was too short. For this reason, she wanted him to love her more. She wanted him to love her as much as he could. She knew that there would be no one else in his life but her. Enrique looked at his beloved with bewilderment, as she was persistent. He asked what had happened. Astaroth wanted every part of him to belong to her. For this reason, she proposed to him to marry. He was extremely surprised. Astaroth asked in bewilderment if he really didn't want this, but he just smiled and said that he really wanted this. After some time, they went to the temple to get married. Despite the fact that she was a demon, she, like a fool, had to pray to God sitting opposite the cross. She wanted them to be together and die on the same day. Some time later, they were supposed to have their wedding night, but sitting by the prepared bed, the lady wondered why her husband had not yet arrived. He asked her not to enter his house. Astaroth thought for a moment, as she didn't understand why he always asked her to do this. She assumed he just didn't want to show off his mess. Astaroth knew he was very nice, but they were a married couple now, so nothing would happen if she came in. After some time, she finally came to his house and called him. She looked at her lover in bewilderment and asked why he was not in their bedroom. The young man was taken aback, and at that very moment rushed towards his wife with a sword in his hand. He struck her straight in the heart, and at that very moment there was a loud roar. Astaroth froze in place, stunned by shock, as she didn't understand what had happened. She looked at her husband in bewilderment and called him. He asked with tears in his eyes why she came to him. While he called her his love, he shouted that he asked her not to come to him. He said that if she hadn't come, he wouldn't have had to kill her. Astaroth looked at her husband in bewilderment, as she did not understand what he was talking about. She was puzzled and did not understand why he was in such radiation. She saw the uniform of an imperial knight and a cross. Then she understood everything, but he burst into bitter tears and said nothing to her. A few seconds later, a woman burst into his house and called him. She rushed to him and hugged him tightly, saying that he was poor and unhappy because he had had a hard time. She shouted that everything would be fine if he brought the corpse of the devil to the emperor, and then the emperor would make him the crown prince. She said that he should be grateful to her. The lady screamed that it was she who noticed the she-devil and told him everything, and without her help, he would not have been able to reach such heights. Astaroth was shocked, as she realized that everything was set up for the sake of the title of crown prince. At that very moment, she couldn't bear it any longer, and fell to the ground with a crash. The lady came closer to her and declared that even if she died for him, she should not grieve too much. Enrique froze in place in shock, but Astaroth could not bear such betrayal and shouted to her lover that she cursed him, while she took on her demonic form. She screamed that she had cursed him and that he would never be able to free himself from this mark. She knew her sisters were right, and she shouldn't have trusted the man. She wanted to be given one last chance. The demon sisters gave her another chance and told her that she must plunge a dagger into the heart of the man who betrayed her. This was her punishment for disobeying them. After some time, she woke up and saw a knight in front of her who was very excited. Astaroth was puzzled as her throat burned with fire. She understood that she was in great need of energy, so without wasting a minute, she pulled the young knight towards her and began to feed on his energy. After that, she fell onto the bed with a thud and realized that this was not at all what she expected. She understood perfectly well that she needed more energy, while the young knight ran away in a hurry because he wanted to call the doctor. Astaroth clearly remembered that she had died, but she wondered where she had even been. To her regret, she did not feel any demonic power in herself, and her body felt very heavy. She wanted someone to save her. A moment later, she sat up, as she assumed that the doctors had already come running to her. But at that very moment, she turned around and saw a young man who did not look like a doctor at all. She looked at him in bewilderment, as she did not understand what had happened to him at all. She briefly considered that it might be the killer. But looking at the young man, she realized that he was too young for something like this. And besides, his physical condition left much to be desired. Astaroth looked at him in bewilderment as he continued walking towards her. She tried to stop him, but her attempt was unsuccessful, and then the maids outside the door became alarmed as they heard a wild roar. The young man stumbled and fell right on top of the lady, while the maids asked if she was all right, but they did not dare enter the room. Astaroth felt irritated, because in her new body, she couldn't even handle an ordinary person. Then she told the maids that she was fine, and they could go. She shouted for them to leave immediately, and the maids obeyed her. Astaroth froze for a moment as she felt his hot breath. She wondered if his fever was due to the injury. But a moment later, she realized that this was not so, because she felt the power of the sun god. Without wasting a minute, she turned it over. She realized that the young man was connected to the god of the sun by blood ties. She was a little surprised, as she knew that he would die in unfamiliar lands. Astaroth, however, understood that he was an excellent medicine for her weak body. She stated that she would save him, but he would need to wait a little. After some time, she left the room, as it became easier for her to move thanks to the young man. She understood that she had to deal with the current situation. On her way, she saw a maid who called her, and she assumed that she was the Empress. Astaroth looked at the maids and asked them to take her to the library. They obediently agreed. She also stated that they should not enter her bedroom, and if the royal physician came, they should tell him to leave the medicine outside the door. After some time, the man met Her Majesty and asked what had happened. She stated that he should take her to the archives where the royal genealogy was kept. She also told him to bring the records for the year. From the records, she found out what year it was at that moment and realized that exactly 5 years had passed since her death, while she assumed that her ex-husband was still alive. Memories of how he had betrayed her surfaced in her head, and as a reward for his betrayal, he received the title of Crown Prince. Astaroth, while checking the documents, noticed that his name was not in the royal family tree of the country, so she had several options. She assumed he might have lied to her about his name, but she also assumed that he was not from this country. She understood what she was in for now, but she needed to gather as much information and positive energy as possible. But a moment later, all her thoughts disappeared as she saw something outside the window. Astaroth was furious, for she saw the young lady whom she had seen before. Astaroth looked in surprise at the girl, who was happily communicating with the prince. The lady told the prince with a smile about the upcoming banquet. Astaroth was furious, as she clearly saw the same face she had seen before her death. A moment later, she saw a contented grin. She was puzzled because she realized that everything was exactly the same as the day of her death. The young man looked intently at his companion and declared that she should find out the general plan for the banquet at the Empress's palace. Astaroth froze for a moment and remembered her beloved, who once looked at her with tenderness. But now she became furious, because she realized that he had become emperor. She realized what the reward was on her head, and in the end, even his name was false. Now she realized that he couldn't even break off relations with this girl. He used her as a victim, and now he brazenly walked around the Empress's palace with the girl. She understood that since he loved her so much, he could make her an empress. A moment later, a knight appeared in her path. The man asked his mistress if everything was okay with her, as he had been waiting for her for a long time. Astaroth, in turn, knew that she had to take the imperial throne. The knight looked at the empress in surprise, because she had never been able to run like that before. He stated that he was very worried because the servant blocked his entry into the room. Astaroth looked at the young man with a satisfied smile and declared that he should leave the medicine and go away, because it was her order. At that moment, she realized that this was her chance to tear the unfortunates apart. She understood that this was her chance to take possession of everything her lover desired. Astaroth understood perfectly well that to do this, she needed to improve her health and get rid of her cursed body. She realized that she needed to eat something, so she approached the cute boy. Leaning down, she tenderly asked him for some energy. A moment later, she turned the young man over and realized that the deep wound was causing him to spasm, making it more difficult to heal. But she did not give up trying to cure him. To their surprise, after a few seconds, they were transported to another place. The lady heard that the empress attempted suicide, but she woke up and immediately went to the library. She assumed that the empress was still in the library because the library window offered the most beautiful view. She looked at her companion with a contented smile because she knew that they would be walking arm in arm, and she would definitely see them. After a short walk, she saw the enraged expression on the empress's face. She was pleased to see such an expression on her face. After all, every time it was the same. The empress became jealous, so she decided to tease her a little. After this, the empress decided to jump and commit suicide. Nyx, a surname that was borne by only two of the most noble people in the empire of the same name. The young lady took possession of it without much effort, simply because she was the adored eldest daughter of the Grand Duke of the Empire. But the truth is that she is just a greedy woman with a fragile body ready to break at any moment, while she shed tears every time from unrequited love. The Empress achieved nothing by her own efforts, and she would rather die than allow anything to be taken from her. The lady understood that the Empress could not be near Henri, who was in perfect health, unlike her. She wondered if the silly Empress would run away in tears again. She was very happy, and so, sighing heavily, she asked the Emperor if he had caught the criminal. Meanwhile, Astaroth moved to another place and looked after the sick person. She noticed that the energy filling this place was saturated with the power of the spirit of water. Moreover, she saw a power that was capable of creating a huge space, so she wondered if he had made a deal with the king. She saw that the young man was not only a contract of the Spirit King, but was also the son of the sun. Long ago, the sun god fell in love with a woman from a desert kingdom. As a sign of boundless love, he passed on his strength and power to her descendants. Thus, the descendants of the sun became members of the royal family of the desert kingdom. But everything had to be paid for. As soon as they left the desert, the sacred protection of the god fell, so they had to spend all their years on the sandy lands. She did not understand why such a man had come to them, but, assessing his current condition, she guessed that the boy had been exiled from his native land. She realized that he had been exiled by a man who was afraid of his strength, and was likely given a task that required him to infiltrate the nearby country and observe their actions. Of course, this was just a pretext. In reality, someone wanted him dead. Astaroth felt sorry for the poor child, but she knew that she could heal him, and in return, he would give her some of his energy. Opening his eyes, the young man told her to get out immediately. She stated that he didn't need to be afraid. They would just have to come into a little closer contact than before, so he could think of it as a goodnight kiss. At that very moment, the young man grabbed her hand and declared that she should not come near him. He looked deep into her eyes and sheepishly stated that he had no intention of satisfying her needs. He quietly whispered that he would never do that. But moments later, he lost consciousness. Astaroth turned around as she felt the presence of the spirit. Looking at the spirit, she said that there were medicines left in front of her door and he should bring them. The Spirit King looked at her intently but said nothing. Astaroth looked at him with a fierce grin as she realized that he knew her true nature. She stated that he would cooperate with her if he wanted to save his contract. After some time, she looked after a young man, and she knew that such a man was difficult to hurt, but he had many scars on his body. The king stated that the young man had never been treated in his entire life. Astaroth was surprised and wondered if this was too cruel to him, no matter how much they feared his power. Astaroth sighed and declared that if she were in their place, She would never have done such a thing to him, because she valued what belonged to her. After some time, the maid looked at the empress with tears in her eyes, since she had been absent all night, and she was very worried. Astaroth didn't realize how much time had passed since she left the Spirit King's domain. They said they saw her go into her room, but when they called her, there was no answer. Astaroth, looking at those present, wondered if these were really the Empress's people, since they were not in the remnants of her foggy memories. She had fragments of memories and sadness. The maid said with tears in her eyes that the Empress could fall ill from the slightest breath of wind. Astaroth assumed that the girl was an Empress who had been abandoned by her husband, but it turned out that she still had some people on her side who cared for her. Meanwhile, sitting in a deep dungeon, the young man was beating himself with a whip, Astaroth for forgiveness, as he realized that he had been a real fool. Astaroth read the Empress's diary. She went through the motions that Helen kissed Enrique, supposedly with the goal of bragging to her. But the worst thing was that she couldn't do anything about it. After all, she was revered by everyone as a saint, but in reality, she was just the Emperor's dirty mistress. Astaroth saw that the diary was filled with suffering and endless sadness, which had already become an integral part of the Empress. Astaroth was surprised, as the Empress loved Eric very much. But unfortunately, he was very cold towards her. She always ran to meet him, but it was all in vain. Because she had a fragile body, and he just walked away from her. The Empress was saddened, because the saint had taken too much from her. Her pain and emotions were scratched out into the pages of the diary, out of any context. But thanks to the detailed description, they became an ideal reference to understand the nature and role of the Empress in this story. She had a lot to remember. A moment later, the knight distracted the Empress from her reading. He looked at her closely and asked how she was feeling. Derek was the Empress's childhood friend and court knight. She was surprised when he visited her room unannounced, but she learned that the Duke had appointed him to look after his weak and hysterical daughter. She knew that not only the young man, but also the ladies-in-waiting, were from the Empress's family house. She understood that they all sincerely loved the Empress, and not Astaroth. Astaroth thought that she had no reason to reciprocate their feelings, because she was very tired of getting attached to people who would eventually betray her. A moment later, she declared that she was fine and asked the knight to leave. She also stated that he should not appear in her room anymore. The young man asked with tears in his eyes if she really wanted to get rid of him. She became furious when she saw that he was crying, because it reminded her of her lover. She was very tired of men's tears. At that very moment, she shouted that he was no smarter than a bear, and with tears in his eyes, he asked for forgiveness. Derek stated that if she said something like that, then it was true. She sighed heavily, as she knew something had to be done about him. Then she realized that he had no intention of leaving, so she had to force him to do it. She stated that if he wanted to be her servant, then she would use him as she wanted. She extended her leg towards him and stated that he should get out. Astaroth knew that for a knight it was more important to preserve his pride than his life, and if he were in his right mind, he would have already turned pale and run away, his heels flashing, while the ladies-in-waiting looked on in surprise at such a thing. Derek sheepishly stated that he would do everything, and began to carry out her order. She was shocked because she expected something different. It was then that she realized she had missed something. She saw a completely maddened man in love. Astaroth pulled away from him and stated that she needed to go. The knight said that he would accompany her immediately, but she only said that she was going to the library and that she didn't need anyone. She knew that she wanted revenge, and therefore she did not have to sit idle. And after all, the position of the Empress was very precarious. She had no intention of being wary just because of her weak body. She knew that if it was too late, she would still get back what belonged to the Empress. At that very moment, Suzanne stated that the library was not cleaned, and therefore she might have developed an allergy to dust. The ladies-in-waiting said that if she needed anything, they could bring it to her. She looked at them with bewilderment, because she understood that they were hiding something from her. She asked if they were hiding something from her, but they said that was not the case. Astaroth looked at them menacingly and said that she did not forgive liars. She stated that if they burn it now, he will tell everything clearly, then she will take the circumstances into account. After some time, they finally told her everything. She saw the letters, and all the aristocrats wanted to know what she thought about the banquet. Astaroth thought for a moment, as she had heard something about the banquet before, but she found no record of it in the diary. International events cannot be organized in a few days, and her subordinates did not even inform her about the banquet. Astaroth angrily declared that the responsibility for receiving letters lay with the headmaid. Madame fell to her knees and began to beg for forgiveness. She said that the empress always became upset at the mention of the saint, and to prevent this, she did not want to subject him to an even greater shock. Astaroth understood them, because now she could move due to the energy she had received, but the real empress could barely move her fingers. So the emperor's mistress decided to take the organization of the banquet into her own hands. She understood that they were very worried about her, but they still had to pay for their mistakes. At that very moment, she thanked the maid and stated that they would have the opportunity to prepare for the banquet, because she had not given permission for it to be held in the Lily Palace. The maid was taken aback, but the lady merely stated that the empress's palace had always done this. She asked how much time was left until the banquet. They said that they still had a month left. Astaroth asked the maid with a smile if she could organize everything. The lady was shocked because she had very little time, but in turn, she stated that she would certainly organize everything. Their fault was that they did not report the event, so they had no right to complain. From now on, she would never renounce what belonged to her. And besides, she had to meet the Quan, the people of the desert, where the young man came from. The day she returned to the bedroom, the boy had already disappeared, but he left a small gift in the form of a bracelet. She wondered if he would return safe and sound, but she sincerely hoped that he would be okay. After some time, the young man finally returned to his home castle and greeted the emperor. He was puzzled because he hated this meeting. After some time, the young man returned to his native land. He noticed the kids who were dripping sand and trying to find water. But a moment later, the children were stunned and looked at the young man in surprise. They were taken aback and started shouting. The children were scared because they saw the cursed prince. They ran away because they knew that if they looked into his eyes, the curse would pass on to them, and they would die. A moment later, he approached the guards and demanded that they open the gates. The guards sighed heavily and looked at the prince with puzzlement, as he had returned alive again, and he greeted him. Some time later, the prince arrived for an audience with his brother, and the man asked the prince if he was wounded. The prince bowed low and declared that he was fine. He looked at the prince with a grin and declared that it was lovely. The Spirit King looked at the prince and asked if he knew who had nursed him back to health. The prince sighed and stated that he had no idea, but in turn, he knew that on my way, we met a very strange woman. After all, she looked like she could hardly take care of herself, but she looked after a complete stranger as if he were her own child. His thoughts were occupied with only one meeting with her. He remembered her delightful eyes. At that very moment, the man turned to his brother and asked menacingly if he had not heard his question. He asked his brother if he really wasn't going to answer. The young man only asked for forgiveness, but at that very moment he turned to his spirit and asked what the man had said. The spirit stated that he was interested in how his mission had gone. Maryam Khan stated that the emperor not only discovered him, but also seized the initiative of the attack. Moreover, he possessed a violent sacred power, and he had no choice but to escape. The spirit told the prince not to be discouraged, as it was truly a miracle, since an ordinary person would not have been able to withstand such a flow of sacred power. At that very moment, he declared that the emperor had not at all expected his brother to return home alive. The emperor of the desert nation, the Khan, Khalik Khan, the man with the wisdom of the serpent and the courage of the tiger, even he had one whose existence was hard to come to terms with, namely, the emperor's younger brother, Crown Prince Maryam Khan, because thanks to the power of the Spirit King, he was the only one of all the emperor's brothers who survived the war for the throne, because it was impossible to kill him. Although he never coveted the throne, any powerful member of the royal family was always a hindrance to the current emperor. So he made up a legend that if you look into Miriam's eyes, you will inevitably die, and it worked. Moreover, using this as a pretext, the emperor from time to time exposed his brother to danger. Knowing that he would not be able to use his power outside the desert state, he sent him abroad, to volcanoes and snowy fields, and no one dared to object because there was no reason to support the young crown prince. The emperor said with a grin that he should allow his body and mind to rest, as tomorrow would be a hard day. The emperor asked his brother if he remembered the revelation. The prince sighed heavily and declared that he remembered everything. After some time, he returned to his room. He knew that he could stay in their room for only a short time, He didn't have good memories of the place, but it was still his home. He understood that no one cared about his desires. If he continued to suppress his emotions, he would stop feeling anything at all. Maryam Khan was sure that such a day would come one day. At that very moment, the King of Spirits turned to the prince. He asked why the prince had given his secret bracelet to that woman, since it was the only reminder of his mother. The prince claimed that she had cured him. He was very surprised, because for the first time, someone did not wish him death since his mother left the earthly world. He assumed that he would see her soon, because he would be sent to that palace again. The prince assumed, based on her medical skills, that she was most likely a servant or a palace physician. He did not dare hope for anything, but if he could, he would ask for only one thing. The prince wanted to meet her no matter what. The next day, the young lady came to the morning meeting, but she arrived a little early and heard moans and cries of pleasure outside the door. She sighed heavily and stated that the emperor was indeed absorbed in his personal life, but the knight did not answer her. Astaroth remembered the day of their wedding, and when they swore their oaths to each other. Astaroth understood that even though she was now human, she was still his wife. But nevertheless, she was a demon then, and she was to them now, an absolutely vulnerable demon, imprisoned in their human body. But whatever the physical shell, this is her true essence. The young people radiated a sacred power that could have instantly killed her, but she was ready for her death. Astaroth understood that she would not only have to meet her ex-husband face to face, but also regain her position as empress. So, without wasting a minute, she burst into the hall and saw her husband, who looked at her with bewilderment. The emperor looked at her in surprise and asked what she was doing there. At that very moment, she saw his mistress, who was disheveled. She looked at the empress with a haughty grin. Astaroth looked at the emperor with fury, as she regretted that in the past she had loved such a disgusting man. Emperor Yertlunik's birth name Enrique. Although his divine power was not ordinary when he was a prince, at a certain point it suddenly grew. It was on the day of the victory over one of the 7 greatest demons that he was proclaimed emperor, blessed by God himself. However, this was far from the truth, because she knew who that power actually belonged to. She knew perfectly well that he had become linked to her, because it was as a result of him absorbing her magic. People are not involved in this process, but pure magic and divine power are completely different things. When magical abilities are transferred to someone, they become sacred powers, and vice versa. She was furious because he had killed her and was passing off her powers as his own, and after some time a meeting was held, with everyone present being very nervous. The empress stated that there would be many distinguished guests at the summit, so both the welcome and farewell banquets would be held at the empress's palace. She stated that from now on she was going to fulfill her duties, so she wanted support from everyone. The young people were extremely surprised by this. At the same time, the aristocrats wondered whether this could be regarded as a desire to participate in political events, since she had previously been bedridden. At that very moment, the Duke asked whether the Empress's duties had not originally included holding banquets. He looked intently at everyone present and declared that he was not speaking of this only because the Empress was his daughter. He stated that until now the saint had carried this burden on her shoulders, but if the Empress insisted, then they had to follow her will. However, everyone understood that this banquet was very important, and therefore they were worried that there might be mistakes. They understood that it would be better to entrust the organization of the banquet to the saint. Since time immemorial, the Empress had been in charge of preparing banquets. Astaroth had no idea why the saint did it for her, but she knew she had an ace up her sleeve that would win everyone over to her side, namely this factional conflict. There were these 3 main factions in the empire, each putting forward its own representative: the emperor's faction, the aristocratic faction, and the temple faction. But in reality, they merely maintained a balance of checks and restrictions. But if she, the duke's daughter, asserts her power as empress, this balance will be instantly upset. The empress knew that the aristocratic faction would not sit idly by, as they supported her. They said that since the empress grew up in a duke's family, she had been taught a lot, so she had to demonstrate her abilities. The saint looked at the emperor with a gentle smile, supporting his decision. At that moment, the emperor sighed heavily and declared that he would allow the empress to manage the banquets. After some time, the empress returned to her chamber, but she was angry. She was very angry because the emperor, you see, allowed her to manage the banquet. Astaroth was shocked, wondering if a person could change so dramatically. but she knew his acting was top-notch. She was burning with rage and anger, as she could hardly move now due to the one who had been under the influence of the sacred power for too long. The only reason she was still conscious was because of a small gift. She wanted to know where the boy got this bracelet. A moment later, she was taken aback, as she heard the Emperor's voice. Looking at the Empress, he asked if she could talk to him. She turned around and gave him a furious and angry look. Astaroth asked why he had called her. He always looked at her with skill, because she usually did not answer him so sharply. He stated that during her absence, Helen looked after the palace. He stated that if she wanted to express her gratitude, she should allow the girl to participate in the preparations. Astaroth was furious and did not understand what other gratitude she should express to her. Astaroth stated that their love for each other was beautiful, but she wanted to clarify something, because the saint was originally the one who did not know her place. The Empress said that she tolerated all her antics only because she loved the Emperor. The Empress stated that she now intends to regain everything she had previously lost. Astaroth, looking at the Emperor, declared that if he did not like this arrangement, he should find another victim or put the saint in her place. The Emperor looked at her in bewilderment and declared that she was not herself today. He didn't understand why her words suddenly became so caustic. She looked at him with fury and asked if he didn't know. She stated that she adored him with all her heart. She, blinded by love, married him and was even ready to sacrifice everything she had. She asked angrily what he had been doing all this time. Astaroth said that from the very beginning to the very end, he hid his true intentions, and as a result, he plunged a knife into her fragile heart. In doing so, he trampled on her essence and inflicted a wound that would not heal. Astaroth looked intently at the Emperor, and at that very moment declared that she no longer loved the Emperor. This is exactly what she had wanted to tell him for a long time. Having said these words, she felt relieved, because she really did not love him anymore. The Emperor looked at her coldly and asked if she was unwilling to fulfill even his personal requests. It stated that it was so. He did not expect that she would feel such a strong dislike towards the saint. He asked if she could give in to him at least once. The Empress had already asked if he really couldn't put his wife in first place, while the knights felt the tense atmosphere and shook with fear. Astaroth, leaving with a smile, declared that the Emperor should go to the saint and tell her to mind her own business. She left, and for some time the Emperor looked after her intently. He wondered uncomfortably if the Empress had always been like this. It was strange, but her aggression did not seem irritating to him. He did not understand why he saw Astaroth in the form of an empress. He was very embarrassed, and although he had felt it once, it was exactly that same feeling. He remembered how the saint had said that he had to trust her just as he had destroyed the vile demon with his own hands. He also had to absorb her magic and finish what he had started. He bound himself to her forever. After a moment, he let go of all his thoughts, as he realized that it was impossible and that it was just his imagination running wild. The Emperor sighed and declared that it was time for them to return. He understood that it was all because he could not forget his love. Astaroth stared into the mirror. She knew that falling did not mean losing, and she understood that it was strange that part of her powers was still with her. She could tell a person's lifespan just by looking at them. She was also able to transform someone else's life energy into her own. And thanks to the bright sun, she could live longer. At the same time, she hoped that the young man arrived safe and sound. She also knew that the Desert Empire had submitted a request to hold a summit. She knew they could send the assassin again in a few days, but she didn't understand why, since both nations were very powerful. She understood that the dysplastic connections were much more complicated than she had assumed. Astaroth understood that it was difficult to make assumptions with only the information stored in the Empress's palace, so she turned to her maid of honor. She asked the maid of honor to organize a meeting with the Duke. A moment later, a maid burst into the Empress's room and apologized for the intrusion. The maid was very agitated, while the Empress looked at her with bewilderment. The maid stated that the saint was sitting at the palace gates and asking for an audience. After some time, the young saint came out into the Empress's room with a joyful smile. She said with a joyful smile that it was the first time she had been in the Empress's palace. The lady looked menacingly at the saint, as she did not observe palace etiquette. The saint said with a smile that she really hoped that they would become close in front of their friends, since they were the same age. She looked at the Empress with a satisfied smile. Astaroth looked at the girl with a smirk and stated that if she had known that the saint was so friendly, she would have spent more time with her. The empress asked the girl her name, since, according to etiquette, one must introduce oneself before entering the empress's palace, but she simply burst into her room. The saint smiled and asked for forgiveness, and the emperor usually did not pay attention to such trifles. She said with a smile that her name was Helen, and the empress could call her by her first name. Astaroth said with a smile that the girl was truly sweet. She allowed the saint to enter, considering it an opportunity since she went to assess what kind of opponent she was. Astaroth watched the girl with a fierce grin, as she was pleased with her behavior. Astaroth understood that if a person crumbled too easily, it would be difficult to torment him for long. At that very moment, the saint smiled and started talking about the banquet. She said with a smile that she thought she might need something, so she brought some samples that she had bought. Helen showed a small sprig of holly and stated that she would like to use it at the banquet to give the banquet hall a winter atmosphere, as it was a symbol of peace. She smiled and stated that since it was always summer in the desert, the people might not even know what winter was. She said with a smile that the berries were beautiful and had a religious meaning, connected with the worship of a deity. Astaroth watched her with a smirk, since it was shameful on her part. She knew she had to let the saint host the banquet and watch her disgrace herself. In the desert, all the decorations for the banquet must be edible, and the guests must eat everything as a sign of respect. But the berries of the holly tree were poisonous, because when ingested, they caused nausea and dehydration. She asked whether the saint knew the vow custom and whether she did it intentionally. She was declared a saint for only one reason, because she was the only one who could heal others, thanks to her immeasurable divine power. She fed all the people with promises, because each time she said that, she would heal them with her magic. At that very moment, the saint announced with a smile that she had compiled a list of the emperor's favorite and least favorite dishes. She smiled and said that she knew this because they were very close, and she hoped that it would help them get along. Astaroth understood that if she had met the girl earlier while in the guise of a demon, they could have become friends, because cunning people are very funny. Astaroth said with a smirk that she didn't even know whether to call the girl a saint or a lover. She said that if the girl was a lover, then she must have been praised for her intelligence. But if she was a saint, then she should not have wasted her time and helped at least one poor person. Astaroth said that she didn't care who the girl would be, and she could take both chairs, but she had to stop playing the empress. The saint was shocked and said that she had no such thoughts. The lady stated that she only wanted to help, and she really tried her best. Astaroth in turn happily hugged the lady. Astaroth looked at the girl predatorily and declared that she should not take jokes to heart. Astaroth, with a smile, offered her companion to treat herself to some peaches. She smiled and stated that they were hard to come by this time of year. At the same time, she was wondering what the saint would do now, whether she would throw something caustic in response, or she would meekly accept the gift. The saint smiled and declared that the peach was incredibly delicious. Astaroth wanted the girl to smile, even when her pride was bursting at the seams, just like the previous empress did. Helen said with a grin that she did not want to quarrel and make the emperor jealous of her, because he was very dear to her, so she wanted to tell him to spend the night with the empress. Helen said with a grin that they could have a wonderful heir, and in any case, she, like a saint, could not have children. Astaroth understood that it was kind of her to speak about an heir, and from Saint Kay's side, these words sounded as if she was giving her blessing for them to have children with the emperor. She felt like she was being provoked. But looking at the saint, she understood that she was only a child. In her entire devilish life, she had met more such people than stones in a stream. The conversation with the saint calmed her down, and she was even glad that they met, because she was just a person, powerless, exhausted, and having difficulty controlling her emotions. The only thing that bothered her was the stupid girl who considered herself a winner and used her little tricks. Thanks to her, she could now look at her hatred, and at the same time, she was ready to thank the saint. After some time, the young empress looked into the holy distance as she left. At this, Madame was furious and did not understand how the saint had such courage to treat the empress. She knew that the saint was simply a cunning fox. Suzanne was furious because the saint had burst in on them unexpectedly and then left just as early. And what angered her most was that the saint had eaten the peaches that they had managed to get for the empress with difficulty. The empress sighed heavily and asked her lady-in-waiting which of the servants in the palace could be trusted. Madame looked at the empress in surprise, as she had not expected such a question at all. Astaroth looked at the madam with a smirk and stated that, judging by what had happened, it seemed that rats had appeared in her palace. Astaroth declared that they should leave only those who were trustworthy and expel the rest. She stared at the saint for a moment. After all, the girl had left the palace quite a long time ago, but until now she had been lost in the courtyard. She understood that this was very strange, and at the same time she assumed that today's visit had some purpose. Astaroth wanted the little viper to show her fangs, which she had hidden for a long time. A moment later, the saint felt ill, and all the maids rushed to her. A few seconds later, the saint fell to the ground with a crash. The empress watched everything that was happening for some time intently. Astaroth was a little surprised and didn't understand what was going on, but at the same time, she really liked this show. She also understood that only she could teach her a proper lesson. The next day, she met with the duke, and he asked if she had really called him for a meeting. Astaroth declared that everything was correct, and at the same time she called the duke her father. The duke was the empress's father and the head of the aristocratic faction. The duke asked her in bewilderment if everything was all right, since he had heard that the saint had come to see her. He sighed and said that he was worried about that incident, but the lady assured him that it was just a trifle that was not worth his worries. She understood perfectly well that the matter entrusted to her was not of the first importance, and the reason for the saint's fall was a simple allergy to peaches. Astaroth knew perfectly well that the saint had come to the empress's palace of her own free will, tasted the peaches and collapsed to the ground. It wasn't even a matter of poisoning, and the diagnosis was clear to everyone, so it was difficult to place all the blame on the empress. Her image, of course, suffered a little, but nothing more. The duke sighed heavily and told the empress that this was their last chance, while she looked at him in bewilderment. He stated that she should use the banquet as an opportunity to crush the saint. He stated that, taking advantage of the favor of the emperor and the temple, the saint would exert enormous pressure on them. She told the duke that he need not worry, and at the same time she asked him to answer her question. She wondered if the Desert Kingdom had requested negotiations with the empire for a reason. The empress looked intently at the duke and declared that he must tell her everything. He was surprised that she had prepared a map. At the same moment, the duke declared that he was not sure, but their intentions were not entirely clear to him. He heard that their high priest had an epiphany, but no one revealed any details, and it was only clear that they had decided to negotiate just after this event. Astaroth, in turn, understood perfectly well that people believed that enlightenment was the work of the gods, but most of them were given by the demon lords. She wondered if her sisters might have been involved. She hoped they were now in the Desert Kingdom. After some time, the maid of honor left the empress and wished her good night. Astaroth fell onto the bed with a crash. She realized that if the duke had not lied, the topic of enlightenment would be raised at the meeting. At the same time, she wondered if this really was a coincidence. After her death and transfer to a new body, she suddenly heard about an epiphany. She realized that, most likely, it was a message for her. She was very interested in what they wanted to tell her, whether they would tease her or pity her or scold her. Or maybe they just wanted to say goodbye to her, while she wondered if she could become a demon again. Astaroth understood that after her revenge, they might not accept her, so she assumed that her territories were transferred to the possession of another demon, or that he conquered them with love. She really wanted to go back, because no one could understand how lonely she was. She didn't know how mortals could empathize with her unbearable loss. She knew that if she went back, she would never love anyone again. She didn't want her fragile soul to be hurt anymore. At the same time, Saint Mary was sitting in her room, crying, and was being consoled by her servants. They were shocked and did not ask how the empress had brought her to such a state. A moment later, the emperor entered their room and told everyone to leave, as he intended to speak with the saint. Helen looked intently at her beloved and called him tenderly, but he sighed heavily and asked if she had just returned, and he had heard that she had fainted, so he wanted to know how she felt. The emperor knew that everything had happened immediately after she left the empress's palace. He wanted her to tell him everything in detail. He looked at her intently and declared that she must tell him everything without concealment. At the same time, he looked at her tenderly and called her by an affectionate nickname. Helen remembered very well the cesspool in which she lived as a child. Her status was lower than that of a slave. People there were prohibited from leaving the isolation zone. There was a ban on work, because people like her were called criminals. She lived in a place where cannibalism was common. But as soon as they heard that people from the temple had come to them and brought humanitarian aid, they immediately rushed to them. They said goodbye to cannibalism and turned to normal food. Helen felt relieved when she saw that they were being given food. She looked intently at the people from the temple, because she understood that they lived well. They lived in another universe, completely unfamiliar to her. Just because they were lucky enough to be born into an aristocratic family, that was the only reason she lived in such a hell. Looking at the people from the temple, she prayed to God and asked him to make one of her dreams come true. She didn't know what she had done to deserve such a life, because she understood that if she had better conditions, she could live with dignity. She sincerely wanted to rule the world and was ready to do everything possible. Everyone present was shocked as it suddenly started to rain, and then a strong lightning bolt struck, although no one expected this. At that very moment, they saw a young girl floating in the air, and she had a sign on her forehead. Moments later, everyone clearly saw her beautiful sign. They were shocked, but still understood that they were facing a saint. Enrique looked intently at his companion and declared that she must tell him everything. Helen pulled away from the emperor and declared that she was fine. He said that she could not hold back her tears. She sighed and, looking at the emperor, stated that the empress despised her for her past. He was shocked by such a statement. Helen knew very well that the empress did not behave in such a way. But if she had said this to the emperor, he would certainly have been angry, because he was worried that she was being despised because of her origin. With tears in her eyes, she said that everyone used to like her organizing banquets, but people's reactions made her think that she didn't deserve it. She thought the empress would take this as a challenge, but at that very moment, the emperor pulled her back and told her that she did not need to worry. He hugged her tenderly and kissed her affectionately. At that very moment, he threateningly declared that she would pay for everything she had done. The young lady's face instantly brightened, and she said with a smile that he shouldn't overdo it. After all, she understood that the most important thing was that he did not lose respect, and then she tenderly kissed her lover. She wanted him not to hold back, and to do everything possible to make the empress regret what she had done. She escaped the slums, so the world owes her better treatment, because it was she who chose the emperor, just as the god chose her. After some time, the young lady sat quietly in a small font. She understood that, no matter what happened, the emperor must love only her. She was puzzled because he didn't even react to the mention of peaches, and so she wondered if he had forgotten. And then she remembered the she-devil. She was furious because she knew the problem was with the one the emperor had once loved, because her favorite treat was peaches. Helen was furious because she knew she had nothing in common with the devil, and yet she knew that every memory had to be buried. Helen knew that the she-devil was already dead, and she shouldn't compare her to herself. For some reason, she was uneasy, and everything was not going according to her plan. The next day, the empress was surprised and asked her subordinates if the palace guards had refused to guard the banquet. Derek sighed heavily and stated that it was true. They only kept saying that they were not allowed to move according to the emperor's orders. She looked intently at the knight, as judging by his expression, they had quarreled. At the same time, she wondered if the emperor had really fallen so low. A moment later, the ladies-in-waiting burst into her office and announced that the designer who was supposed to make her dress had said that he would not be able to due to unforeseen circumstances. The architect and artist had also cut off all ties. She was furious because the people they worked with had let them down. Astaroth understood that the emperor wanted to tie her up. She wondered if he was afraid of losing face before the upcoming summit. She understood that they wanted to ruin the banquet so that in the future she would be ashamed to raise her head. And this all happened because of the concubine. She knew it was time to gather her own army, so she turned to her subordinates. Astaroth looked at everyone present and declared that they should listen to her carefully. Meanwhile, the men were leisurely walking to the training ground, and they were quite drunk. They understood that they were still members of a knightly order, even though they had hit rock bottom. A moment later, the man entered the training ground and realized that someone was there. He stood there for a few seconds, stunned, looking at the empress. But a moment later, he was filled with embarrassment, for she was truly beautiful. The man looked at her in bewilderment and called out to her with embarrassment. The knight rushed hastily to the empress while his comrades were recovering. The young man asked his friend if it was really true that the Empress simply couldn't have been in such a place. But a moment later, they realized that the real Empress stood before them. Astaroth looked at them with a smile, because she understood that they had simply gone crazy. She saw that before her were hopeless and fools. There were only 3 knightly orders in the Empire: the Emperor's personal guards, the Imperial Order, the Holy Knightly Order of the Crusade, and the Royal Order of the Valkyrie. In order to organize a banquet in the palace, she needed to choose one of them as a guard. But the Emperor's retinue refused to help her, and the Knights of the Royal Crusade did not belong to the Imperial Court. She knew that she had only one option left: the Valkyrie Knights. Having taken the wrong side in the struggle for the throne, they completely lost their influence and disintegrated, so only a few people remained of their order. Astaroth looked at the men intently and declared that they must bow their heads before her. The knights immediately followed her order. At the same time, they whispered among themselves because they did not know what she was doing in such a place. A moment later, Derek announced to the Empress that he had brought a man. He showed her the current commander of the knights, while the man was quite drunk, and asked the Empress why she needed them. Astaroth looked with disdain at the knights, who were drunk. At the same time, she understood that it was not at all surprising that everyone in the palace was talking about their abolition. She heard that many knights had resigned after the execution of the previous commander. She believed that these were all who remained, and since she had no choice, she wanted to bring them to their senses. She said that she would study with them. Derek was taken aback and looked at the Empress in surprise, as he did not expect this. The knights looked at her in bewilderment, as they were shocked by what they heard. That same day, the Empress met with the new architect. Madame greeted the Empress shyly. Astaroth, looking at the woman, stated that they had a lot of work to do, so they could skip the pleasantries and get straight to the point. Astaroth asked the woman if she could install an artificial waterfall and a small pond in the main banquet hall, as she wanted the decorations to reflect the religion of the Khan people. She told the Empress that it would be very expensive, but the Empress did not care about the price, since this was her first banquet under her leadership. She looked at the woman with a smile and said that she should let her imagination fly and enjoy the work. Madame was a little puzzled and did not understand why the Empress was giving her such an opportunity, since she was far from being a famous architect. Looking at the Empress, she said that she was without status and glory. Astaroth knew that everything was right, and that was the reason she invited her. After all, the people she had hired previously were very skilled and talented, but they were not recognized for their gender or similar characteristics. In the world of architecture, women were not particularly trusted. She understood that the best choice for the devil was to create a puppet for himself. She wanted to fulfill the desire of man and tame him. Astaroth stated that she had looked through all the works of the graduates of the architectural school, and she had selected the most remarkable works, which turned out to be Madame. Hearing such praise, the Madame declared that she would try her best to create a masterpiece. After some time, preparations were underway for the banquet, and as the Empress passed by, she heard the maid speak of her, not saying that she was a very good person. She was glad about this, because she knew that she was gradually achieving her true goal. At the same time, the knights were, to say the least, surprised, and could not believe that the Empress came to training every day. Considering the fragility of her body, they envied this tenacity. The knights understood that they, too, should not despair and should make every effort to improve. She dispelled her bad reputation step by step, communicating directly with her subordinates, and everything went according to her plan. After some time, she met her knight and asked about the schedule, but at that very moment she suddenly felt ill. Derek was shocked by this, but without wasting a single minute, he ran to her. She was furious, as she understood that her body could not withstand it. Derek nervously asked the Empress if everything was okay. She sighed heavily and tenderly called the knight. He was very agitated and shouted to the ladies-in-waiting to call the physician, but the Empress assured him that this was not necessary. Astaroth was furious because she felt dizzy from a small amount of physical activity. She claimed that she only had a brief attack of anemia. Derek looked at her worriedly and said that she needed to rest more because she had been overworking herself lately. Astaroth looked at the knight with a smile and asked if he would prefer that she never leave their chambers. Astaroth stated that this was the only way she could remain in his arms as before. He was shocked by such words. A moment later, she was distracted, as she was informed that the tailor and designer had arrived. As she was leaving, she stated that there were no more of them. I was shocked and didn't know what to answer her. Therefore, for some time he stood silently on his knees, unable to answer the Empress. After some time, the Empress visited her knights and said with a smile that they should look at her and what she was wearing. They all declared with one voice that she was beautiful, and the Empress, with a smile, declared that she knew it. Uncle to the knights, she said that she was going to provide this form to all the Valkyries, and it was an unofficial form, but she assured them that it would be very comfortable. The knight thanked her with a smile for this, because he now understood why she made them take measurements. At that moment, she shouted and asked if they could once again become famous as the Royal Guard, and they unanimously declared that they would do everything for this. She looked intently at everyone present and said that this banquet was extremely important to her, because it was her first banquet. But the Royal Guard did not want to help her. Unfortunately, she could not call the crusade that fought monsters throughout the country. Astaroth said that this was the reason she needed their help, because she no longer wanted her property taken away from her. She was sure that they knights felt the same way. Astaroth said that if they were with her, she would make sure that they received good treatment. Her situation was unstable, so she couldn't guarantee it, but she wanted to try her best. The captain stated that after they had completely collapsed and drowned in alcohol, he thought they had become useless creatures. But when she came to their rescue, they felt joy. The man looked closely at the Empress, and with a satisfied smile declared that she had given them a chance. At that very moment, they knelt before her and declared that this was enough for them. Astaroth looked at the knights with a satisfied smile, as she understood that all the preparations were now complete. Meanwhile, the young man was on his way to the imperial palace. Astaroth knew that there were several things in the palace. One of them was an excess of wealth. The other was the legitimacy of her being the rightful empress. She was interested to see how to deal with something like this, Emperor. After some time, all the guests arrived for a luxurious banquet. The aristocrats present were truly surprised, for they did not know that the Empress could arrange such a magnificent banquet. They understood that this was a completely different level compared to the saint who had hosted banquets before. They wondered how much longer they would have to watch someone put themselves on display. But they also realized that the saint seemed to have realized her place. The saint only greeted all the guests present with a smile, but they all ran away from her in a hurry. She was furious because she realized that the world was unfair to her, and unfortunately, she could not throw a banquet by spending a lot of money. She knew that if she had a family like the Empress, she would have achieved more. She was shocked when the Emperor announced that he had to go out with the Empress and greet the guests, as they had always gone out together before. She was furious and did not understand why he sent her alone, because she had to listen to a lot of unpleasant words. A moment later, the young lady turned around as she heard the Emperor and Empress coming out, but a moment later, she saw the guests from the other side. Helen was taken aback for a moment and froze as she saw a handsome young man. She looked him straight in the eyes, embarrassed, as she was struck by his beauty. But in turn, the young man did not pay any attention to her and simply walked past. She was absorbed by his beautiful eyes, but she understood that he was the complete opposite of the Emperor. Helen, in turn, for the first time in her life, passionately desired something. She wanted it regardless of power. A few minutes later, the Emperor and Empress entered the hall. They looked closely at all the guests, but also did not ignore the banquet's honored guests. Astaroth, in turn, looked at everyone present with a satisfied smile. While her companion was looking at her nervously, Astaroth knew perfectly well that she had to watch her words, because one word like diplomacy could cause problems. The Emperor looked at everyone present with a smile and declared that they had recreated the land of warriors from their mythology. He looked at the Empress with a satisfied smile. Astaroth smiled and thanked the Emperor for his attention. She understood that, looking at this, it was hard to believe that he had pushed his younger brother to become a killer. At that very moment, the Empress turned her attention to her husband, who was staring at the room and paying no attention to her. He was extremely surprised, because even though all connections were severed, she managed to assemble new staff and achieve a similar effect in such a short time. He looked closely at the Empress and wondered if she was really the one, because he saw how much she had changed. Astaroth hoped that the banquet would end quickly, because she was afraid that she would soon run out of strength. She wanted to know what revelation was about to come. A moment later, she turned around because she heard someone's footsteps. Turning around, she saw a young man who was looking at her in surprise. Meryem was extremely embarrassed by her gaze, as he did not expect to see her at all. The Empress looked at Astaroth with a smile, as she noticed that she liked the prince very much. She stated that if Empress Nyx took a liking to the great prince, things would go much more smoothly. Astaroth answered Cassandra with a smile, and Cassandra was extremely surprised that the Empress knew their language. While they were chatting pleasantly, the men also entered into casual conversation. Cassandra said, with a smile, that it was very difficult for a foreigner to distinguish certain words from their language, so this alone showed how well she knew their language. Astaroth assumed the girl intended to flatter her, so she wondered if she had ulterior motives. Cassandra looked at everyone present with a smile and declared that they should understand the meaning of their words, because an oracle had descended to them. The couple were extremely surprised by this statement. A moment later, the emperor stated that the oracle had informed them that this dagger, which was a special item, had been presented to Empress Nyx. He stated that if they had not done something like this, the desert of death would have stopped expanding. Enrique was very surprised, as he saw that they were presenting her with a weapon, but the emperor stated that they did not need to worry, as it was a blunt blade. He reported that the desert of death was in the center of his country, and it was a big nuisance in that place where only demonic beasts lived, and it was getting bigger recently, so he sincerely begged the Empress to accept the blade. Astaroth, in turn, was extremely surprised by this, but looking at the young man, she wondered what her sympathy for him meant. She wanted to know if it had anything to do with their gift. Enrique looked at the Emperor in surprise and asked if he didn't know why they ordered this to be sacrificed to the Empress. The Emperor said with a smile that he didn't know the will of the gods. But at that very moment, he declared that perhaps the great will of the gods had descended upon the Empress. He asked if they would like to test this. For some time, the Empress looked intently at the prince, not daring to approach. She remembered his surprised look and guessed that he didn't even know she was an empress. Astaroth thought it was sweet of him, and then decided to go up and touch the blade. But moments later, a bright light illuminated her. Astaroth! At that very moment, she was transported to another space, and at the same time she heard the voices of her sisters. She looked around as if this place was familiar to her. A moment later, she saw a reflection in the mirror, and there she saw her original form. She realized that she was in the spiritual plane. But moments later, she heard someone's voice. She recognized her sister's voice, so she started screaming and calling her. She was informed that she had to go a little further to meet her older sister. After all, she knew very well that her older sister was an unusual demon. And to see her, she had to delve into her secret. Astaroth turned around and met her sisters, who were looking at her with smiles. Trembling, she told her sisters that she missed them. They hugged her tenderly and told her that they missed her too. They said that she could not even imagine how bitterly they cried after losing her. Astaroth, with tears in her eyes, asked her sisters what she needed to do to become a demon again, as she missed them very much. They claimed it was an answer they couldn't give her, but a moment later, she felt herself begin to fall somewhere. A moment later, she was informed that she should continue moving on her own until she met their older sister. After a few seconds of falling, she landed on the ground. Astaroth was extremely puzzled, as she found herself in a very familiar place. She was furious because they sent her to a place where she died. She became furious because she understood what was in the hut of her husband, who had betrayed and killed her. Then she heard her sister's voice, saying that all her powers had been stolen, right down to her magic core, and even her soul had been torn to pieces. She looked closely at her sister and stated that she was pleased to see that she looked more whole than they had imagined. Astaroth, rising from the ground, said that this was not so, for she was burning with rage because he could not tear Enrique to pieces. She asked if they were sisters who had placed her in the soul of a man. She said that it was so, because they had endowed her with magic so that her soul would not fade away while they waited, until an empty vessel appeared, chosen by their older sister. Astaroth sighed heavily and understood why she woke up only after many years. Demoniza looked at her intently and declared that she should be grateful to her sisters. She told her sister that she had no idea how long they had to negotiate the causal chain because she was involved in so many causal chains. Astaroth asked with a smile if her sister was also in this place. She sighed heavily and stated that it was so. She looked at her sister closely and stated that perhaps she didn't know, but she was undergoing tests. Astaroth looked at them in surprise, as she didn't understand what they were talking about. She asked them in bewilderment what they were talking about. She wanted to know what she needed to do. They said that she should open the door and go outside and do what she had not been able to do then. She was informed that she would discover the only way to return to the form of a demon, but it would undoubtedly be a difficult and desperate method. Astaroth looked at her sisters with a satisfied smile and declared that if their words were true, she too could truly return to her demonic form. She would do anything. They stared at her for a while, and they also told her that the same cruel future might await her, that her happiness would turn into sorrow, but she should not forget that they were waiting for her. A moment later, she opened the door, and as she left the room, her appearance began to change little by little. At this point, the young lady was a little puzzled as she returned to the Empress's bedroom. She did not understand why she was in such a place. A moment later, she was greeted, but she froze in bewilderment as she saw the young prince who was tenderly embracing her. She was puzzled because she saw in front of her the child she had saved earlier. Astaroth looked at the young man in surprise, as she did not understand why he was in such a place. Her sister asked her if she liked the given uniform. She was taken aback when she heard a familiar voice. She was happy to see her older sister, so without wasting a minute, she hugged her tightly. She said with a smile that a long time had passed. Astaroth looked at her sister in bewilderment, as she did not understand why she was in the form of a child. She stated that the child was related to the ordeal she would face. A moment later, her sister began to slowly disappear. Astaroth was taken aback because she only saw fireworks in the sky. She knew that her sister was a being who was able to see the destinies of gods and men. She was the darkness that spewed forth from the underworld, the one who controlled life and death. Astaroth realized that it was her sister who had given her this test. At the same time, she was presented with a dagger that contained a small part of all their powers. She was told that with this dagger, she would find the heart of the man she truly loved. She was also informed that when the blood of the long heart touched the dagger, she would be able to return to them. The young lady was shocked by her sister's words, as she did not understand their meaning. The sister said that she sent a man who would love her love, so she hoped that her sister would thrust the dagger straight into his heart. The young lady was shocked by such a statement. She was taken aback and realized that the boy had to die. Astaroth now understood how the boy was connected to her. Her sister stated that the sisters laughed and said that she had terrible taste. Astaroth was embarrassed, as her taste was obvious, though she admitted she couldn't stop thinking about his face. Astaroth immediately shouted that she had no intention of loving a man. She did not understand how she could do something like that again, because the betrayal she experienced from Enrique was too heartbreaking. For this reason, she vowed to never love anyone again. She was in shock because she didn't want to love, and her sister told her otherwise. She had to put an end to love with her own hands. She told Astaroth that it must be. She thought it was cruel, but she couldn't just go back to them because she had to remember the test. She was told that she could fall in love with the Emperor again, or she could be with someone else entirely. It didn't really matter. She was told that she could shed tears of blood, but if she did not stop loving. But unfortunately, she can never return to defeat the demon. She was in shock, and then she was told that she would become an ordinary person. Then she would forget all her memories of what had happened, and she would also have to forget all her emotions. Astaroth understood that this should not happen because she wanted to return to her family. She could not lose everything. She was told that over time, she would become more and more human, and over time, she would become a creature of a completely different type than a demon. She was told that she should not forget the lessons of life. They told her that she shouldn't be alone, because they loved her and were waiting for her in the demon realm. All the sisters looked at her tenderly and said goodbye. They were sad because she had to leave them. Astaroth, in turn, screamed and called for her sisters, as she did not want to leave them. At that very moment, she realized that the ritual space was beginning to disappear. She screamed and called for her sisters, but it was all in vain. After a moment, she began to return to reality. They said goodbye to her and asked her to return to them. A moment later, she came to her senses and found herself back in the banquet hall. Turning around, she realized that she had returned to reality. The aristocrats present asked her what she had seen, because she stood there for several seconds in a daze, saying nothing. Astaroth sighed and stated that she only heard a voice. She looked at the emperor intently and stated that the voice said that the divine revelation was not the only one. The emperor said with a smile that it was indeed curious, because there were several discoveries. At the same moment, he introduced his brother, with whom there is quite a big age difference. Astaroth looked intently at everyone present. She knew that in a pack, a mature leader could easily defeat a challenger. But it often happened that a mature leader was torn to pieces by a young beast that had just reached maturity. The emperor, with a grin, pushed his brother closer to the empress and declared that, as the gods had ordained, he would leave his younger brother to the empress. She understood that he just wanted to get rid of his little brother. With a smirk, he asked her to be kind to his little brother. At that very moment, the prince knelt before her and greeted her. Astaroth froze for a moment and stared at the prince, as she understood that he had come to her to die at her hands. She knew that his brother and his sister-in-law would clap their hands and rejoice as he walked down the path to death. Yet she knew that even her sisters had set him on the path to death. At the same time, she, looking at everyone present, wondered what she should do, because she was a little out of her mind, while she understood that everyone wanted him to die, but she had no desire to kill him. Astaroth came closer to the prince, and with a smirk declared that if he wanted to be hers, he better learn not to bow his head. She still wanted to accept him for now, because she understood that he would be a good tool to not be satisfied with Enrique. The emperor froze in rage as he saw what his wife was doing in the banquet hall. At the same time, from a distance, the saint observed everything that was happening. She was furious when she saw that the empress had obtained the young man she so passionately desired. Meryem Khan is the only half-brother of Kalika, who ascended the throne after the murder of 13 brothers. The nobles knew that the emperor had spread a rumor that the prince was cursed. The problem was his overly handsome appearance. Carefree noble ladies mocked him, but still cast flirtatious glances, and they invited him to their bed every time. At the same time, the young man was very embarrassed when he saw the empress approaching him. For some reason, only with her did he not feel disgust, and at the same time, he wanted her to touch him. Everyone present was shocked. They could not believe that the empress had opened such a thing right before the emperor's eyes. They stood silently for a while and watched the emperor's reaction. After all, in front of everyone, she was introduced to her lover. After the empress had filled herself with energy, she looked at the young man with a smile. Astaroth stared at him for a moment, as he was very confused and innocent. Kalik Khan looked at the empress with a satisfied smile and called her. At that moment, he turned to the emperor and declared that he already had a concubine, so he did not think that this would offend him in any way. Enrique declared that Helen was not a concubine at all, but a saint, and he expected her to be treated accordingly. At that moment, he heard a chuckle from the emperor's wife, Kalik Khan, who said with a smile that he remembered that in their country, as in their homeland, there is a status called holy. Cassandra stated that in their desert, priestesses occupied a very sacred position. Cassandra looked at the saint with a predatory grin and stated that they believed that the priestesses should dissociate from politics and maintain their holiness and purity. Helen was shocked by this statement, as it was a stone thrown at her. At that very moment, she turned around and decided to leave the hall. Astaroth looked at the empress with a smile and declared that the winter garden was truly wonderful. She asked Cassandra if she would like to take a walk with her. She understood that they wanted to establish friendly relations with her, and not with the emperor. After some time, Cassandra looked at the truly beautiful garden with a smile. Astaroth smiled and said that it was her pride. Cassandra said that it was hard to bear when her husband glanced at the strange woman. She stated that her husband was not the kind of man who showed affection to anyone other than his wife, and of course, with so many wives, his patience was running out. Cassandra was furious, as she knew that the woman's shamelessness pierced the sky. She could not understand how she dared to attend such an event, since she was not even the emperor's wife. Astaroth looked intently at her companion, as she understood that her anger was real. Cassandra sighed heavily and declared that it was unacceptable for a concubine to even set foot in the banquet hall. Astaroth saw that her companion was not simply trying to win her favor. She sincerely sympathized with her. Astaroth said with a smile that it seemed that Cassandra was in love. Cassandra was taken aback, as she did not expect such a thing, but at the same moment, she declared that it was so. She stated that her ideal type is a strong man. Astaroth asked if she would love her husband if he were weak. Cassandra smiled and stated that then she would not love him. She only loved strength. Meanwhile, the young saint stood on the balcony in proud solitude. She was burning with anger and fury because the barbarians had dishonored her. Helen was extremely angry, and she simply could not understand how the empress dared to treat her in such a way. She understood that she was not at all obliged to stay away from politics. Helen couldn't stand it any longer and angrily hit the granite railing of the balcony, thus injuring her hand. She looked at her hand with a smirk, because she realized that this was very funny. After all, her divine power was born from her desire, and it was a gift from God himself. A moment later, she was taken aback and turned around because she heard some noise. Turning around, she froze in place as she saw a young prince walking towards her. They stared at each other for a while. The prince came to his senses and asked for forgiveness. The saint hurried after him and tried to stop him. She felt sorry for him, as she understood that he had simply been offered as a lover. At that very moment, she announced that she had hurt her arm and asked if he could help her, at which point she stumbled and fell right into his arms. Then she looked at the prince with embarrassment and asked for forgiveness for her clumsiness. She stated that she was prone to weakness, so she often lost consciousness. The prince, in turn, looked at her with contempt and said that he thought the saint of the Holy Empire would be different. She looked at him in bewilderment as she did not understand what he was talking about. He immediately pushed her away and declared that she was vulgar. Meryem looked at her with fury and stated that she had a wound on her hand that had already healed, so he had no reason to take care of her. He said that it was best for her to wag her tail only for her master, and she was to remember that. The saint was shocked by his words. She hurried after him, but all her attempts were unsuccessful. He left, and she stood there for a moment in a daze. She was furious because he said that she was wagging her tail. She didn't understand how he dared to say such a thing, because she was a saint. Unlike the empress, she was the one who monopolized the love of God and the emperor. But then she threw all her thoughts away because she saw the maids. The maids were talking among themselves, as they did not know what to do with the goods, since they had taken them with them because the like was too valuable to waste. For a moment, the saint looked at them with a predatory grin, as a cunning plan was already lurking in her head. After some time, the ladies returned back to the banquet hall, and Astaroth stated that she very much hoped that they could meet again. Astaroth sighed heavily, as she was very tired, because they suddenly went on a night walk, and it became difficult for her to support herself with the energy she had absorbed earlier. She felt heavy, and her head began to spin, but she could not see what was around her. Everyone present was shocked, because they saw their friendly people falling to the ground, and no one understood what was happening. Cassandra rushed to the emperor, as she did not understand what was happening. Astaroth, in turn, was furious and did not understand what was happening at all, since a few minutes earlier, everything was normal. At that very moment, she stumbled and began to fall. But the young prince easily caught her and held her. He looked at her closely and sheepishly stated that she was unsteady. Astaroth looked at the prince with a smile and thanked him for noticing in time that she was feeling ill. He looked away from her and said that he was waiting for her to return. She absorbed his energy again and asked what happened. He himself said something else, that some members of the court suddenly started vomiting for some reason. She noticed that he was acting strangely in a formal manner for some reason. Meryem, in turn, stated that the common factor was that they dined next to a small table. The empress looked at the table and noticed something interesting. Then she gave the order to the imperial knights, while the saint slowly returned back to the banquet hall. She was stunned when the knights approached her. At that very moment, the knight pushed the saint so that Anna would kneel. She was in shock, because she did not understand what was happening at all. The knights dragged the saint to the empress, and the emperor rushed towards her, as he did not understand why they were behaving towards her in such a way. He grabbed his beloved and angrily asked the empress what was going on. Astaroth looked at the emperor in bewilderment and asked what he meant, since she had merely held the saint accountable for recklessly causing harm to the guests. She looked at him intently and told him that he should not give in to emotions. The emperor was shocked. Meanwhile, the saint looked at everything that was happening with bewilderment. Astaroth looked menacingly at the saint and asked if she was upset that she was not allowed to hold the banquet. The empress called the emperor and said that he should look into the distance at a small pot. She said that he could see the berries of the fire rose, which caused severe abdominal pain and vomiting. She stated that, originally, the firethorn was not to be used at the banquet, and this fact was also indicated in the banquet plan she prepared, as she specified that only edible fruits were to be used, and even listed the categories of fruits that were permitted. Astaroth said that regarding the firethorn, before she took on the duties of the banquet hostess, this element was prepared by the saint as the main component of the banquet, and the emperor was aware of this. Astaroth angrily asked why there were such things in the banquet hall. She wanted to know where the maids who were in charge of the decorations were. Now everyone saw how bad things were for their fellow countrymen. At that very moment, one lady raised her hand and declared that she had seen something. Looking at the saint, she reported that the maids from the Lily Palace brought the vase and placed it on the table, while she thought that it was just a decoration. Astaroth looked menacingly at the Holy One and declared that they now had witnesses. She declared that she had to find out what the maids from the Lily Palace were doing at this banquet. Astaroth said that their guests also wanted to know about everything. Enrique looked at everyone present, as he was glad that we were witnesses. He ordered the arrest of all the maids of the Lily Palace who had entered the banquet. The saint was shocked as she understood that they were only arresting her palace maids. She was furious as she understood that such a thing could not happen. After some time, the emperor was informed that the interrogation was completed, and at this point, the saint was taken aback and froze in a daze. The emperor was informed that the guest's condition was not too serious and that they would probably be ill for about a day. Kalik Khan looked menacingly at the emperor, as this was unfortunate. Kalik angrily declared that if his troops could not rise by tomorrow, this incident would go down in history as the beginning of a bloodbath. After his words, dead silence reigned in the hall. Helen asked for forgiveness with a smile and stated that in that case, she would heal them with holy power, because with her holy power, they would instantly recover. The emperor came and looked at his beloved in surprise. She stated that she did not bring such a thing into the banquet hall, but still she could not turn away from the sick man, so she used her power and rose into the air. Helen looked at everyone present with a satisfied smile, as she understood that she could change this situation in her favor. The aristocrats looked at the holy power with surprise and joy. Astaroth looked at the saint with a smirk, as she realized that this was her plan from the very beginning, but she understood that the saint should have kept this to herself. At that very moment, Cassandra intervened and declared that this was absurd, and that she should not raise her hand against their warriors. The saint looked at her in surprise, and the emperor asked her to stand still and not move. She rushed excitedly to the emperor and asked if she had done something wrong. The emperor declared that desert warriors from birth to death should never accept power from another religion, for if they did so, they would become apostates, unable to enter the paradise of which they were proud. Astaroth looked at the saint with a fierce grin, as she understood that she should have studied everything more carefully. At that very moment, the saint began to cry and declared that she did not know this. Everyone present began to whisper among themselves, wondering if the saint had always been like this. They understood that from now on, she should not interfere in diplomatic affairs, but they saw that the empress was trying to smooth things over, while the saint was only making things worse. Astaroth looked at the saint with a satisfied grin and understood that she only knew how to make excuses. Helen used her charm and compassion as a weapon to give wise advice on family matters. She was even called the Divine Compass. But diplomacy is something else entirely. The charm she used as a weapon was perceived only as rudeness and ignorance. They did not understand how she could organize a banquet, because she did not even understand the culture of other nations, while everyone knew that if it were not for the empress, a catastrophe would have happened. The Astaroth, looking at Cassandra, stated that the saint was born with divine power, but she knew nothing about the culture of their court. Astaroth stated that the saint had not meant to offend them, but they could not simply ignore her ignorance. Astaroth, looking at the guests, said that she would give them a fitting punishment and do everything possible to help their warriors recover, so she asked for their understanding and generosity. Cassandra stated that since the empress had said such things, she could let the situation go, but she was still unhappy and did not want to see the saint at the banquet. The empress smiled and said that she would pick it up and see what it could do. Enrique looked at his wife in surprise and wondered if she could always behave like this, because he found her behavior strange. It seemed to him that a completely different person was in front of him. He no longer saw the woman who had been bedridden all her life. He knew that a person could not suddenly become a skilled diplomat. Astaroth looked at her lover with a smile, because she noticed that he was reading a book about the courtyard. She asked if he knew about it too. He asked in bewilderment what she meant. Astaroth said, with a smile, that among the divine revelations, the Hertik was a revelation sent by a demon. He looked at her in surprise and asked if it really wasn't sent by God. He didn't understand why people didn't know this. She stated that they were essentially the same, and people could not distinguish between gods and demons. Enrique was shocked because he knew that she had been given the dagger today, and she had also recovered from her illness very quickly and had become a different person. He wondered if it was just a coincidence. He was scared and wondered if the Empress had made a pact with a demon. Enrique looked closely at his wife, as he knew he needed to conduct his investigation quickly. At that very moment, the knight shouted that the maids had arrived. The knight threw the maids at the feet of the Lord and declared that it was they who brought the vase into the banquet hall. The Empress looked menacingly at the maids and declared that she knew perfectly well that it was they who brought the berries to the banquet hall. She said angrily that they had to explain in detail exactly what had happened. The maids, trembling with fear, said that they were very sorry for what they had done, because they had done such a thing because the saint was sad. They said that the saint and they, among others, had been diligently preparing for the banquet. But when everything the saint had prepared suddenly turned out to be unusable, they brought a similar decoration, hoping that there was at least some chance that it would be useful, since it seemed to them a simple waste of money. Some time ago, the maids were talking among themselves because they didn't know what to do with the decorations, but they knew that the theme of the banquet was fruits, and they wanted to use berries as decoration. At that moment, they looked up as they heard one of the ladies crying. A moment later, they were taken aback as they saw the saint. They did not understand why she was crying, but the saint declared that this was not so, and then they assumed that the Empress was again oppressing the saint. Helen, bursting into bitter tears, said that she felt like a terrible person. She said that her Empress had arranged a wonderful banquet, but for some reason she was very sad. And at the same time she said that she had been too presumptuous because everything she had prepared was of no use. It seemed to her that her preparation did not exist at all, and she asked the maids for forgiveness and asked them to pretend that they had not seen anything. The maids looked at each other and asked the saint not to be sad, as they knew what she felt. They said they had prepared a small gift for her, so she would only have to wait a little before entering the banquet hall. They said that she would see and appreciate their gift. The girls cried and said that they only wanted to console the saint. Helen looked at the maids with bewilderment, because she did not understand what they were talking about, but she did not understand why they told her all this. But she knew that this banquet was a nightmare from the very beginning. She didn't like the banquet from the moment the Empress used her precious family to throw an exclusive banquet. Helen saw that the Empress did not look ill at all, and yet she conversed freely with foreign monarchs, understanding all the difficult words. She even received a beautiful lover as a tribute. Helen looked at the Empress with sadness and sorrow, as she sincerely wanted to stand in her place. She is very strong. She wanted to take over the place of the Empress, and at the same time, she wanted to see the Empress at her feet. The Emperor attacked the maids with fury, because their carelessness had harmed the health of their esteemed guests and undermined the dignity of their nation. He angrily asked if they would atone for their sin by death. The maids were shocked, as they did not want anything like that, and at the same time they begged for forgiveness. They cried out to the saint and begged her to save them, and at the same time they cried out that they did not do this with evil intentions. The saint was furious. She did not understand why they were clinging to the Empress, while she understood that everyone would be looking at her. Helen looked at the Empress with fury, because she had no intention of apologizing and asking for mercy on the maids. She refused to obey the Empress's words. Helen had a few tricks for this kind of situation, and one of them was hyperventilation. The Emperor picked up his beloved and asked her to come to her senses, while everyone watched them closely. Enrique, taking his beloved in his arms, declared that everyone else should step aside, as he intended to take the saint to the room. The Empress looked after them with fury and declared that he must stop. She asked if he really meant to say that he was going to leave without finishing the discussion. He followed her words and stopped, but at the same moment he declared that she could have sorted everything out herself. He decided to leave the hall and hurried into the room, with the knights hurrying after him. Meanwhile, the young saint sat in her lover's arms with a contented grin. She was pleased that he had chosen her, but she understood that the empress might be the star of the banquet, but everything else belonged to her. After some time, the empress returned to her palace, was greeted, and asked how the banquet had gone. Astaroth said, with a satisfied smile, that the operation went smoothly, and it was all thanks to them. Madame smiled, feeling relieved. There really was a man who leaked the theme of the fruit banquet to the palace maids. And there was a man who bribed a servant girl from the imperial palace to give testimony. This was all done by the excellent Madame Suzanne. Suzanne said with a smile that they were all very worried about the empress. At that very moment, the empress staggered and felt her fragile body. She realized that she was very tired and had reached the limit of her capabilities. She understood that she had to introduce the prince to her subordinates and go to bed quickly. The empress looked at the prince and said that she wanted to tell him everything, and that today he was living in her palace. She said that the prince was the only brother of the emperor and a member of the royal family, so they should treat him with respect in accordance with his status. She looked at the prince and stated that in front of him were the people she trusted the most. She said that they were very reliable, so he could get along with them. To her chagrin, she did not have time to introduce them, and at that very moment she staggered. Derek hurried to the empress. But to his regret, he was late, and the young prince picked up the empress in his arms. Miriam, looking at the empress, said that if she had previously felt that she was dying, she could have asked to be carried. And yet all this time he was worried. He did not understand why she stubbornly walked on her own 2 feet when she was ill. Derek stood frozen in shock when he saw such a picture. The empress looked at the prince with a smile and declared that this side looked much better. She looked closely at the young man and declared that the darkness did not suit him. Derek, looking at the prince, asked for permission to help them, because he served the empress. The prince had no intention of handing over the empress to him and declared that they must be led to the empress's bedroom. Derek glared at the prince and declared that the role of the chaperone in the bedroom had always been his. Derek stated that since the empress was unwell, it would be better for someone more familiar to serve her. The prince stated that he did not want to repeat himself several times, so they should show where the empress's room was. Astaroth understood perfectly well that Derek had always courted her before, and now he felt confused, since his own responsibilities were being taken away from him. After that day, she fell ill and was unable to attend the rest of the banquet, but the same was true for the saint who had caused the incident. She left the palace for a while to focus on her official activities. More good news came to her from the Duke, who wrote to her that everything had gone as she had said. She was glad to hear good news, as everything was going strictly according to her plan. A moment later, she looked up from reading the letter. Since the prince had come, the empress told the prince that she could walk to the dining room, so she invited him to eat together. The prince declared that he had no intention of doing this, since after he had stood there all week, this place seemed comfortable to him. Maryam stood at the door all day until the empress woke up. She knew full well that she had saved him once, and so she wondered if he might have already become attached to her. Maryam asked the empress if she was okay. She smiled and thanked him, but at the same time, she asked with a tender smile if he was really worried about her. Maryam looked at her in surprise, as he had not expected such a question, but at the same moment, he became embarrassed. As he sat down at the table, he stated that nothing of the sort had happened, but she noticed that he had behaved very nicely. She thanked him with a smile for worrying about her. Looking at the table, she noticed that there was no meat, but she stated that the prince was in the growing stage, so they had to prepare dishes with meat. He looked at her intently and declared that he really didn't mind such dishes. He stated with sorrow that these were the only dishes he could swallow at the moment. She was taken aback and looked at him in surprise, as she did not expect such a thing. A moment later, they finally brought him some meat, and he began to eat. Astaroth looked with a satisfied smile at the young prince, who was devouring his food. She watched him for a while, as she had the impression that it was his first time trying a steak, because he had such an expression on his face. Astaroth, in turn, could clearly imagine how he was treated in his native land. She stated that after the main meal, they could eat cake. He noticed how she was pressing on him, so he was not going to lag behind the empress, and without looking at us anymore, he began feeding. Astaroth sighed heavily, but still obeyed his will, and she noticed that she often laughed when she was with him. She knew Derek was always formal when he was around her, but the prince was different, and that's why she liked it that way. After some time, the maid told the empress that for the first time in a long time, she had had a hearty dinner. The empress said with a smile that she always ate her fill, but this time she simply gave in to her mood. After a moment, she dropped all jokes and asked the maid how about the task she had given her earlier. The maid of honor declared that everything was prepared, and the empress glowed with joy. All the servants of his empress's palace were checked. A total of 67 people showed even the slightest suspicious behavior. Madame stated that a list of all persons was compiled. The empress said with a smile that they had done well, and therefore they should change the positions of those people. Madame asked what they should do with the vacant positions after the changes. Astaroth said that they could place an announcement throughout the empire that the empress's palace was looking for new servants, and they planned to select candidates regardless of age, origin, or region. She stated that those who had children were also welcome, and if their child was under 10 years old, they were to prepare housing in the palace for the empress, where they could live together. If they were older, they could provide support. Madame was extremely surprised by her generosity. She understood that in this case, everyone would start supporting the empress, and this is exactly what she was striving for. Astaroth understood that right now she was losing to the saint, not only in terms of position, but also in terms of public opinion. She remembered her husband, who had chosen the saint over the devil. But since they had taken everything from her, she intended to do the same to them. Astaroth understood perfectly well that she had to lay a foundation that no one would dare challenge. The empress looked at her maid of honor and declared that she had one request for her. She smiled and said that she needed to hire an assistant, because she absolutely needed an assistant to properly carry out the administrative work. And someone experienced, smart, flexible, and cunning would be ideal for this position. She knew she had one guy back in her old days, the one who did all the annoying tasks for her when she was the monarch of the demon realm. After some time, the empress met with her knights. The knights immediately attacked her as they heard that she was not feeling well, but they were extremely surprised when they heard that she had lost consciousness after returning. They were very eager to know if she was okay. Charlotte looked at everyone present and declared that they should step back from the empress. They understood that they had given in to their emotions, but unfortunately, they could not do anything despite them. The empress became distracted and looked away. At that very moment, the captain approached her and declared that after the welcoming banquet, all talk of the imperial knight's uncertain future had died down. He assumed that this was because the nobles had seen that they were acting on the empress's orders. The imperial knights turned away from the saint by order of the empress. This fact could be summarized as follows. Valkyrie became the empress's sword. She said with a smile that it was all because they followed her orders. At that moment, she introduced the prince. Astaroth said that she would like him to train with them from now on. The captain stated that they had heard rumors, so he was wondering how they should address the prince. The prince said that they could call him by his name. He looked at the captain intently and said that they could avoid using honorifics and they could treat him as a fellow knight. Young knights, we were surprised by his statement, but a moment later they followed his command. He was extremely surprised by such attention. Astaroth looked closely at the knights, because she had recently told them to handle the prince with care, but they had done the opposite. But looking at the young people, she felt delight, for this was what she had hoped for. A moment later, the young lady was taken aback as a cold wind blew. The prince came closer to her and wrapped her in a shawl. He looked away from her, embarrassed, and stated that if she felt like she was about to faint, she should go inside immediately. Astaroth froze for a moment in confusion, as she knew that ever since the prince arrived, he had been constantly taking care of her. And as a result, Derek's situation worsened significantly. When the prince intervened, Derek showed a hint of displeasure, but remained silent the whole time. He understood perfectly well that there was a significant difference in their statuses. She knew that Derek understood that the prince's concern for her was just affection, since he was sold to another empire and became attached to her as a guardian. For this reason, he could not interfere in their relationship. As she left, the empress stated that she would take a leisurely stroll around the training grounds and that they could go and train. This tension between them made her uneasy. At the same time, she understood that the most important thing for her now was to think about how to pass the test that sister had prepared for her. Astaroth knew perfectly well that plunging a dagger into her heart was one thing, but first she needed to find someone worthy of loving again. She was a little puzzled and wondered who was worthy of love. She looked intently at everyone present, and she understood that there was no such person, because all the knights present were not to her taste. She saw that the prince was her type, but he was too young. Astaroth saw that Derek was also not bad, but she understood that he loved not her, but the real empress. Asia was not at all attracted to a man who loved another woman. She was puzzled and wondered if there was no way to gather all the decent men and choose one. A moment later, all her thoughts disappeared as she heard a noise. Astaroth looked into the distance in bewilderment, as she did not understand why the noise had suddenly arisen, but she saw how the knights were shouting excitedly. The knights were extremely surprised, as the young men were supposed to spar on the very first day, but at the same time, they really wanted to see the fight. Astaroth looked at them with surprise and bewilderment. The prince looked closely at the knight and asked if this was what he had wanted for so long. He could see that Derek was simply pretending that he did not want to spar. Derek stated that he was simply following the Empress's orders and that he only intended to train the knight. Charlotte looked at the Empress with excitement and suggested that she sit down and rest a little. The Empress agreed. Astaroth looked at the young men in surprise, as they were planning on sparring. In fact, she was planning on ordering them to do so once they were properly warmed up. Derek looked closely at his opponent and prepared to spar. Looking at the young people, she already saw who would win this fight. A moment later, they clashed in battle. Miriam looked at the knight in surprise, as he turned out to be stronger. But he had no intention of giving up, and so he easily dodged his opponent's blow, which discouraged him. Astaroth looked at the young people with a satisfied grin, as she was interested in who would win. After an intense fight, everyone saw that Derek had defeated the prince, but the knights present could not take their eyes off them, as they were both incredible. Everything went as the Empress expected. She understood that, as a human, Derek was an outstanding knight, while Miriam, on the other hand, was still a child. She understood that if the Spirit King had functioned in the proper manner, the result would have been different. She understood that there was one reason why the spirit was not functioning properly, and it was all for the sake of the prince's life. Because the prince was the son of the sun, it was a great blessing and a curse at the same time, because the excess energy of the sun was corroding life, and this made it impossible to live to adulthood. The prince was born with a particularly strong energy, and it was dangerous to such an extent that even the Spirit King must always spend his energy to cool the prince down. This had to be done by the time the prince's body was fully grown. At the moment of his body's full development, the yang energy that was like a curse would become a powerful blessing, and from then on, the Spirit King would also be able to freely use his power. She assumed that in about 3 years he would return to normal, and then he would surpass his older brother, and perhaps he would even surpass Enrique. The prince looked menacingly at his opponent and declared that they must fight again. Astaroth looked at the prince with a smile, since he wanted to compete. She understood that after they spilled the beans to each other, they would become closer. Unfortunately, her guess was wrong, as the prince accepted defeat every time. Astaroth, in turn, looked at the young people with bewilderment, since she did not understand how long they had been planning to do something like this, since the sun was about to rise soon. She knew she had no choice, so she coughed in front of them, and they instantly dropped everything and flew up to her. They shouted to the ladies in waiting to quickly bring water for the Empress. She said with a smile that they did not need to worry about her because it was just dust. Astaroth looked at the prince with a smile and declared that he had done well and that she had gone to teach him how to become stronger. He looked away from her embarrassed, and at the same time he agreed with her words. Maryam said that he needed to become stronger to become her husband. She sighed and stated that he had seen and heard things in the desert that were not very beneficial for a child's emotional development. She said they intended to treat him as a husband. The prince was stunned by her words, and at the same time, he asked what he should do. He knew that she was the only person who saved him. When he didn't see her, he felt anxious. It turned out that in front of him was a man who, like a shell, disappeared when he opened his eyes. He wondered what he wanted to do with her. At the same time, looking into her eyes, he felt that he had to be useful to her. Maryam understood perfectly well that he had to help her, but he didn't know how. The Empress said he had to find another dream. The prince looked at her in bewilderment, since no one had ever said anything like that to him before. Astaroth said with a smile, "I will bring that he should dream about who he wanted to become and what he wanted to do." The prince asked if it would be appropriate to dream of him wringing his brother's neck. A moment later, he stated that he did not know whether he wanted to live or die, but he still felt uneasy since he came to her. After all, earlier they gave him a beautiful room. They sewed new clothes for him, and at the same time they prepared tasty and unpoisoned food for him. He was a little puzzled, as he was receiving things he had never seen before. She saw that he continued to cling to her. Astaroth pulled the young prince's face closer and stated that it looked like he wanted to leave. She said that it was all because he wanted to live, and he would continue to live. From now on, that was all he needed to know. Meryem, in turn, shyly asked the empress whether he could become her husband. She smiled and said that it was not so because he was very young, and she could not stand children. At that very moment, she started talking about the bracelet he had given her, since the bracelet's function was nothing more than a divine force shield. She wanted to know where he got something like that. Moments later, the empress was taken aback as she felt the power of the bracelet. She was in shock and did not understand what was happening at all, as she felt an enormous divine power. She felt as if an order of knights of the crusade had come to her in a group. At that very moment, the emperor entered with the knights and asked what the empress was doing in such a place. He was furious and did not understand why a royal resident of the neighboring empire was in the training grounds of the imperial knights. Enrique looked at them with fury and waited for an answer. The empress just looked at him intently and, breathing heavily, called out. She asked the prince to let her go, and the emperor looked at her with anger and said that she must answer what she was doing in such a place. She said she was just observing the night training, he asked, puzzled. What she knew about it. Astaroth, unfortunately, was not in shape to fight him even verbally. She was furious because his divine power was not working well on her. She could hardly breathe and could barely stand on her feet. Astaroth, looking at the emperor, said that if he did not want to tell her anything, then she would leave. Enrique looked at her sharply and told her that she had to stop. At that very moment, he said that he had heard what she had done in his hometown, for it was said that she had prepared for the great flood even before it happened, preventing any damage. She looked at the emperor with a puzzled expression, as she realized that he had just found out about this. One of the measures she had prepared to enhance the empress's reputation using the knowledge she had gained during her time as a demon. At the same time, she asked for help from the duke, the empress's father. At present, Han was suffering from the disasters where the desert of death was gradually expanding. She knew very well that the water had disappeared from the desert, and somewhere in the world there would definitely be a flood. She already knew in advance that the emperor's hometown would be engulfed in a flood, so she arranged everything in advance. The emperor looked at her with fury and said that he wanted to know how she could prepare for such a thing. He assumed that she already knew that the place given to her would be overtaken by a flood. He looked at her with fury and asked if such a simple coincidence was possible. She steadfastly withstood his angry gaze, but she did not answer. At first it was a very small suspicion, but her personality changed noticeably, a statement that seemed to belie her past, and even her outstanding eloquence and diplomatic skills, which had never been there before. The empress he once knew was Sturda, and she had changed, as if she had become a different person. Until now, these were only his assumptions, so he watched her from afar, quietly. But after long observations, he realized that she had made a contract with a demon, because he had no other way to explain her changes. He asked how she predicted that there would be a flood in the city. He asked if she, too, was the cause of the flood. She sighed heavily and stated that she was not a demon and could not do such a thing. The emperor became furious and stated that she must answer the question asked. At that very moment, she said with a smile that she did not know whether he would believe her or not, but she had received a revelation. The emperor was taken aback, as was everyone else. Everyone present was shocked, as they understood that since she had received a revelation, this automatically made her a saint. She stated that she saw that all her efforts were in vain. The knight claimed that the empress had just reported having received a revelation, but the emperor knew it was a lie to attract attention. Astaroth looked at them with fury and asked what good would come from lying to her. After her words, the emperor froze in a daze, as she now spoke exactly like his first lover. He looked at her with fury and said that she had been irritating him a lot lately. Astaroth sighed and stated that the god who had descended upon her had also said that the emperor was getting on his nerves. She stated that she would be grateful if he would simply state the reason for his coming. She had really reached her limit and wanted him to go away. The emperor looked closely at the knights and stated that he respected their actions and wished to express his gratitude for their long service to the nations and the imperial family. However, the question of the further existence of the detachment had already been discussed several times. He looked closely at all the knights present and declared that their detachment was disbanded. The empress and everyone else froze in shock, as they had not expected anything like this at all. At that very moment, the knights rushed to the emperor and began to say that he should reconsider his decision. They begged him for mercy on their knees. The empress understood that he was taking revenge on her for forcing the saint to kneel at the banquet. She was furious and could not bear to see such a thing. The emperor stated that this matter had already been approved by the Council of Aristocrats, as there was a growing trend of young talented people possessing divine power appearing throughout the country. Therefore, it was decided to double the number of participants in the crusade. They wanted to use this place as a dormitory and training grounds for the knights who joined. The empress was shocked as she realized that they increased the number of people who possessed divine power. She knew that this was a very bad sign. People might not know it, but the law of causality did not allow the balance to be disturbed. If the number of those who possessed divine power increased, it meant that the number of demonic beasts would also increase. She knew she should have told the Duke to reorganize his personal army and contact experienced mercenaries. Astaroth looked closely at the emperor and wondered if these knights were no longer knights of the Imperial Guard. He declared that this was so, and at that very moment the empress beamed as she understood that this was the ideal sequence of events. The knights looked at her in bewilderment, as they did not understand why she was happy. She glared at the knights, as she didn't want them to bow their heads to anyone. For some reason, she just hated seeing what belonged to her so sad. She approached the knight and announced with a smile that she planned to establish her own personal knightly order. Astaroth stated with a smirk that according to imperial law, the empress could also command a personal order, such as the royal guard. The holy knights were taken aback, as they did not expect to hear such a thing, while the emperor was dissatisfied with her words. They knew that legally this was possible, but there had never been a case where it was actually done, because it was a clear statement of opposition to the emperor. She asked if the emperor would go back on his word. He looked at her intently, but did not answer. And for a moment, there was dead silence between them. Astaroth looked at the pathetic emperor with a fierce grin, as his smug expression was erased. She knew he was just a child who cried when he was overwhelmed with emotion. She knew he was hiding his emotions only because he wore a tattered crown. She wanted to tear the crown off him, to make him show his true self. That pathetic weakness he showed when he accused her, and even when he killed her. She wanted him to cry as if he were suffering. She looked intently at the emperor and declared that she would immediately come up with a name for the knightly order. Moments later, the empress, with a fierce grin, declared that the order would be called Astaroth, and she thought the name was wonderful. The emperor froze in shock, as he had not expected anything like this at all. He remembered how his beloved cursed him. He remembered all the moments of their intimacy. He remembered how she said with a smile that he should remember her name, since she would soon become his beloved. Astaroth looked at the emperor with a grin and tears in her eyes, as she realized that he remembered her name perfectly well. At that very moment, everyone rushed to the emperor, as they noticed that he was feeling ill. Astaroth was furious and knew it was very funny, but for some reason, she really wanted to cry. But a moment later she hurried as the young prince took her hand. Then the knights bowed before the empress and declared that they would follow her. She expected nothing else from them. She glared at the emperor and stated that she would use her personal funds to renovate the empress's palace, to create training grounds and a dormitory, so he wouldn't have to worry about such things. At that very moment, she hurried away, while the emperor was extremely confused. He reached for her as if he wanted her to stop, but she only wanted him to remember her true name, the name of his woman whom he had killed. After some time, the empress returned to her palace, and she could hardly walk, but she understood that she had to hold on. The prince caught her and said that she could have fallen, but he still caught her. Unfortunately, she didn't have the strength to fight, so she relied on the prince. At the same time, the emperor, sitting in a dark and damp dungeon, atoned for his sins. Astaroth, the great demon whom he killed with his own hands. He wondered if the demon the empress had made a pact with could have known the demon he had killed. And he also wanted to know if it was truly a god who had given her the revelation or if it was someone else. Enrique killed her with his own hands and even absorbed her power so that she could not be resurrected. They first met with the purpose of using each other, and Enrique asked the saint why she had come to this village. She stated that there was a demon living in this village and they could kill it and offer it to the emperor so that he could become the next emperor. He was shocked and did not understand how he could kill the demon. She stated that he was too far in line for the throne. She said that he himself had previously said that he wanted to become an emperor, so she wanted to help him and become his compass. She looked closely at the young man and asked if he trusted her. He smiled and stated that he trusted her completely. Enrique kissed her tenderly and declared that she was the only one he trusted. At the same time, he understood that the feelings could not go according to plan, since he met the demoness and immediately fell in love with her. He was charmed by her unexpected kindness and purity. After he drowned in her charm, he shared their love. After which, they finally got married like normal people. Then he decided to save her. He decided to give her to the saint, who was precious as half of his soul. Sometime later, he realized that it was too late to take any action. After all, the saint and the main forces of the Crusaders were far from the village. Then he burst into his house and realized that he needed to run away quickly. He understood that he had to run away, but he didn't know how. He knew that his beloved was the god of war, and she would never listen to his warning, and she would not run away with him. He understood that if he told her about something like this, she would fight with the knights, and then the saint would die, like the knights. A moment later, he was taken aback, as the saint ran up to him and hugged him. She said that she knew perfectly well that he wanted to betray her. He was taken aback and trembled with fear, and he began to make excuses, but she assured him that he did not need to worry, because she was the only one who knew his true intentions. She stated that, most likely, the cunning demon had simply deceived him, and she handed him the sword, and stated that he should take it and destroy the cunning demon. She said that she would be his eternal compass, so he just had to go where she told him. At that very moment, he made important decisions for himself. Astaroth slowly entered his house and called her husband. He was frightened and stunned, as he had hoped that she would not come to him. He wondered if he would have been able to make a different choice if she had not come. He understood that he was wrong, and the saint was right in her actions. He knew he had made the right choice, but after that, he couldn't feel any emotions. All that remained was the mighty divine power and the crown with ardent support. He realized that he had earned this much by selling her breath and her corpse. He was confused and lost because he realized that he could not be happy after her death. Enrique knew he had killed her body, but her soul was still alive. He assumed that something like this was possible, so he prayed to God. He wanted God to give him another chance. The next day, the young lady looked closely in the mirror and realized that her remaining lifespan was only 1 year. She was in shock because she tried to prolong her life, but everything was cut short. Charlotte came closer to the Empress and asked if she was okay, since her complexion was not very good. The Empress said with a smile that she was fine, she just had dust in her eyes. However, she understood that she had not spent her life force in vain, because she had made the Valkyrie her own knights. She understood that if she raised them well, they would become a valuable asset. At that very moment, she told the knight that she would like to ask something before creating a new knightly order. Astaroth looked closely at the knight and said that she would like him to become the commander of the knightly order of Astaroth. Derek was taken aback, as he did not expect such a thing. The Empress said that she really hoped that he could help her. He would be more useful in this role than bedroom furniture. Astaroth looked closely at the young man and with a gentle smile asked if he would do this for her. Derek looked away from her, embarrassed, and declared that he would do anything for her. She was glad of this, and at the same moment asked Susan what public opinion was in the castle. Madame declared that public opinion had begun to improve, and the Empress was very glad to hear this. She stated that they still had to work on people's opinions, and Madame agreed with her. She noticed that they were uncomfortable with the Empress giving orders immediately after waking up. On the other hand, she understood that a real Empress would never do anything like that. Even she understood that it was high time to make an official statement about the reason for her changes. Astaroth, looking at those present, declared that there was one thing that she had not told them, and it was about the divine revelation that she had received. It was a performance by one actress to convince her confidants. The audience consisted of 3 people. She understood that if everyone was convinced, the play would be a success. She sighed and stated that she had talked about it with her father beforehand, and now she felt that the time had come to tell them everything. Astaroth fell asleep and stated that after that she fell and was unconscious for several weeks, while she constantly heard a voice that told her many things. Astaroth found it hard to believe that she had heard the voice of a god, so she assumed that she had completely gone mad. But after some time, people from the delegations came to them and said that she had divine will, and when she took the dagger, something amazing happened. She stated that she saw a new world, and only then realized that God was looking for her to deliver a message. Charlotte asked the Empress in surprise if this meant that she was a true saint. The Empress sighed and stated that it was difficult to say anything about this, since she did not have divine power. She stated that, for this reason, she had doubted herself for a long time, and if she became a saint, then in the end it would be fair to have divine power. She said God told her it was because of the Constitution. Looking at everyone present, she stated that, as they all knew, the divine power had no effect on her. Madame, with tears in her eyes, stated that everything was true, because the Empress suffered a lot because of this. She sighed and stated that her body was too weak to contain the divine power. Instead, they said that they would share their divine knowledge with her. The Empress's maids of honor were shocked, as she was incredible, but they understood that they could immediately exorcise the saint. Astaroth stated that it would be very difficult because she did not have divine power, and the Emperor did not believe her. She supposed there was nothing she could do if word spread, but she had no intention of coming forward and officially presenting herself as a saint. She only wanted to help the empire and all the inhabitants. They were touched by her words. Astaroth looked closely at her knight, wondering if he accepted her words. At that very moment, she announced that they were going to repair the Empress's palace, so she needed to send a letter to her father. Charlotte smiled and shouted that she would take care of this issue. Unfortunately, she didn't have time to leave the Empress's room when she suddenly bumped into the prince. Astaroth looked at the young man with a smile and asked him to enter the room. She asked everyone present if they could give her time to talk to him alone. After a few seconds, they were left alone. The prince asked the Empress if everything was okay with her. She smiled and said that everything was fine with her. A moment later, he was taken aback and looked away. He remembered walking into the room and the atmosphere. Astaroth looked at the prince and said that he could come to her at any time, and he did not need to ask permission or worry about what others thought. He came closer to her and asked if it was because his power was saving her. She realized that the Spirit King had told him everything, and then the Empress declared that he had thought correctly, so she could do anything for him. Miriam looked away from her with embarrassment and asked for permission. She looked at him in bewilderment, as she did not understand what he was talking about. She asked if he meant the goodnight kiss she had mentioned the first time they met. Astaroth said with a smile that it was delightful, since he had been waiting for her to wake up to kiss her. At that very moment, the Empress touched him and called him to her. Trembling with embarrassment, the prince came closer to her and kissed her, while he used his power and filled her with energy. Miriam looked at her shyly for a while after the kiss. He felt calm, but a moment later, he sat down next to the Empress, and he was extremely embarrassed. Previously, he thought that he would end up in another hell, which was in his homeland, but having arrived in such a place, he felt calm and peaceful, and all thanks to the Empress. He never knew that this was exactly what the Empress would propose to him, because his brother only told him to be a good lover for the Empress. But after some time, he found out that she was the Empress. This realization brought him both joy and despair after all, to be Empress at first, that she was already married. Emperor Nyx, the man who inflicted his wounds, and she was his wife. Miriam, looking at the Empress, wondered if the Emperor had really been treating her badly all this time. At that very moment, she lay down on the bed as she did not want to answer his question. Miriam, in turn, knew that on the day of the banquet, the Emperor had protected the saint, and not his wife. The prince did not understand how the Emperor could protect that woman, and in general, he did not understand how the Emperor could look at anyone else when he had such an excellent wife. He understood that she did not deserve such treatment. Miriam came closer to her and said that she should wait a few more years. He stated that as soon as he grew up a little, he would make sure that no one could ever treat her like that again. He intended to become more powerful than the ruler of her nation, and he wanted to take everything she deserved. The empress was extremely surprised to hear this. She looked closely at his embarrassed face and thanked him. At the same time, she looked at him with sadness, because she understood that the most important thing for her was to return to the origins of her former life. She knew she had to love someone, but she didn't know if it was possible to force herself to find someone like that. But she knew she would never love him. That night she had a dream, and in the dream she was holding a dagger, aiming it at a young man. At the same time, she looked at his magnificent face with sadness. He smiled at her with tenderness and warmth. At the same time, the prince himself reached for her dagger, which she was holding in her hands. Astaroth was stunned by his choice, and at the same time, she was at a loss. After all, the prince voluntarily took the blow to the heart and died in her arms with a smile on his face. She cried bitterly after what she had done. For the first time, she saw the most terrible nightmare of her life. That same cold night, the young lady woke up from a terrible nightmare. She was in shock and did not understand what kind of dream she had seen. Some time later, everyone in the empire was whispering back home that the empress had received a divine revelation, and they understood that this made her a saint. After which she began recruiting maids with good benefits, and everyone heard that she was incredible at the party. They wondered if under such circumstances, the emperor could return to her. That same evening, the saint shouted at her servant not to give her the medicine. She was furious because the emperor said that he had caught a cold and could not come to her. At the same time, she knew that the empress was to blame for everything. Helen did not understand how the empress could claim to have received a prophecy, and if she did not have a drop of divine power. Helen was furious because she realized that everyone was chatting nonstop without knowing anything. She understood that she and only she had divine power, and she was a saint. She was burning with anger and fury because she knew that these things belonged only to her. Helen understood perfectly well that this was the only light that had ever illuminated her miserable and unhappy life. She didn't understand how the empress could steal something like that from her. The servant approached the saint and asked if she wanted to drink some water, but the saint pushed her away. The maid was taken aback and asked the lady for forgiveness. Helen knew perfectly well that she had not always been such a person. After all, it was the empress who made her like this, turned her into an ugly person who knew nothing but hatred. Helen was furious and angry because she just wanted the empress to fall dead. At that very moment, she was asked if she needed help. She was taken aback as she was alone in the room in front of the mirror. Helen stood frozen for a moment, as her reflection was not hers, and Helen did not understand what was going on at all. At that very moment, she saw someone climbing out of the mirror. She was shocked and did not understand who she saw in front of her. The next day, Charlotte woke the empress. At the same time, she was very excited and wanted to know if the empress was okay. The empress woke up with tears in her eyes and did not understand what the servant wanted from her. Charlotte told the empress that she had been too stressed lately and that she should cancel all her affairs and rest a little. The empress assured her that everything was fine. She sighed heavily and declared that it was all because of what she had dreamed, a nightmare and nothing more. Charlotte asked what kind of nightmare she was talking about, but the empress said that she had dreamed a nightmare about a man she had never even met. She realized that she had seen a grown prince, and she sighed and declared that the moment she hugged him, he died. Looking at her maid, she declared that it was very sad, but Charlotte could not answer. For some time, she silently, and with sadness on her face, collected her mistress, the empress said. The maids do not worry about her gloomy words. Charlotte was taken aback and stated that her words might have sounded incorrect, but she had had a similar dream. She stated that a man she did not know kept appearing in her dreams. He was incredibly handsome, and she dreamed that she was hugging him. Astaroth smiled and told her maid that she must have wanted to meet someone. So she offered to introduce her to someone. Charlotte resigned and said that there was no need to do that. A moment later, Madame entered their room and announced that it was time for them to get down to business. Charlotte stared at them for a moment, lost in her thoughts. After all, there was actually something she didn't tell the empress. The man in her dreams was incredibly handsome. At the same time, he was not human at all. Astaroth took back the state affairs that the saint had previously managed. She expected the emperor to resist, but he was surprisingly silent, which made everything easier for her. The only small problem is the lack of assistants. Madame told the empress that there are several people for the position of assistants, and she will have to meet with them. A moment later, all the representatives entered the empress's office. She looked at everyone present in surprise. But moments later, she saw a familiar figure. She was shocked and could not understand how he ended up in such a place. She saw before her the most notorious known eloquent demon in hell. Before her was a master of negotiation who would not lose a single grain of barley. He was scrupulous enough to fuss over one coin and notice one wrong dot, the ideal middle manager who made his subordinates tremble with fear. The one her sister desired so much. An assistant who was more than just competent, the unrivaled Pavel. A moment later, she sent everyone else away and left only him, and he happily rushed to her. He kissed her hand tenderly and declared that he had come to serve her. Pavel said with a smile that he heard that she needed his services. Astaroth asked how he knew that she needed an assistant. He said with a smile that her sister told him everything. At that moment, she could not bear it and hugged him tightly. Astaroth sighed and stated that she was indeed glad to see him. At the same time, she said with a smile that she would never forget his devotion. He smiled and asked how about her tripling his salary when they returned to the demon realm. She smiled and stated that this was the Pavel she knew. Pavel looked at the lady with a flirtatious smile and declared that she could allow him to be her favorite companion. At that moment, she pulled away from him and declared that it looked like he was pushing his luck. Astaroth asked how the demon kingdom was currently being used for governance. He said that it was a complete mess, because without a ruler with overwhelming demonic power, every day was chaos. The administration was paralyzed by the work that had paid off. She asked in surprise if he was really tired of this, had dropped everything and run away. He smiled and said that it was so. He stated that it did not matter at all who took her place, because as long as he was not there, the demon kingdom would never function properly. At the same moment, the empress praised him and asked him if he had heard about the dagger from her sisters. He asked if they needed to find a suitable target, someone she could reasonably fall in love with, to kill with the dagger. She sighed and stated that it was. Pavel said with a smile that, in his opinion, the more candidates, the better. He said that she could take an example from her sister. Astaroth smiled and stated that her harem had occurred to her. Having scattered the documents, he declared that they would create a harem and name him the choice of the empress's husband. Anyone asked what she thought about this, she said it was not a bad idea, but it still did not completely displace the saint. She said that public opinion of the empress had only just begun to improve, and she was not yet able to hold such events. Pavel stated that it would be better if she naturally fell in love with someone within 3 years. But if she did not succeed, she could hold an election for a spouse after she improved and expanded her power. Astaroth agreed with him with a smile, as she understood that this time should be enough to strengthen her power. She didn't know if she could find a decent husband, because her standards were incredibly high. He said with a smile that he would find a suitable one. He said that among all the candidates, there would certainly be one person who would touch her heart. Pavel, in turn, bowed before the lady and declared that he had something for her. The young lady was taken aback for a moment and stood frozen in anticipation. At that moment, he presented her with half of his mana core. He wanted her to use it to regain her true power. The core of the mana demon was the source of its strength and life energy. For the demon, it was akin to a person giving up half of his liver. The empress reached out to his heart. She thanked him and declared that she would never forget his sacrifice, while she slowly consumed his heart. He watched her transformation with a satisfied smile. Astaroth, in turn, felt a long-forgotten feeling. She thanked her friend with a smile, because he saved her a lot of time in preparation. He smiled, because he was glad to hear something like that. He said that he didn't care where she was as his mistress, so all the options sounded tempting, yet he wanted to see her use her mana freely, as before. She understood that this was not enough, because she needed to kill several monsters and absorb their cores. At that very moment, the prince entered the room and asked if they really made her stronger. They were taken aback, as they did not expect to see him. The prince looked intently at the empress, as he wanted to get an answer. Astaroth looked at the young prince and his companion with a smirk. As, with the help of the king of spirits, he hid his presence from the demons. She looked at the prince intently and asked him to come to her, and also asked if anyone else had heard their conversation. He stated that this was not so, and he himself had only heard the last part. After some time, he left the empress and slowly walked around the courtyard. At the same time, he saw that people's architectural skills were not so bad. Pavel thought for a moment about the young man he had seen earlier, as he was practically the ideal type of mistress. He understood that there was no need to wait several years. But a moment later, all his thoughts vanished as her young lady tripped and fell right into his arms. Charlotte looked at the young man with a smile and thanked him for his help. But a moment later, her face changed. She immediately remembered her dream and the man who was not a man at all. Pavel looked at Charlotte with a smile and asked her to be a little more careful. Charlotte stared at the young man for a moment, as he was incredibly handsome. Astaroth sighed heavily and told the prince that, as he had already heard, she needed monster cores. He asked if she meant the stones in the hearts of monsters. While drinking tea, she casually stated that it was true. She said they were painful for people, but she needed them. He asked if she would live longer if she had stones. She sighed and said that wasn't entirely true. Meryem could not resist and asked if he would become more valuable if he brought them to her. Meryem wanted to know if he would be more valuable than the other person who came before. She froze in place for a moment in shock. At that moment, the empress stroked his head and said with a smile that it was very kind of him, but he was already valuable, so he did not need to do anything dangerous. Miriam asked if he could become stronger. She saw that he was very persistent, and she stated that he could become stronger if he was with other knights. Miriam looked at her intently and sheepishly declared that he would be the one to bring her everything she needed. Astaroth, in turn, was extremely surprised by the prince's words, but then she sighed and declared that she would have to enjoy watching him grow up. She knew that hunting any monsters would take at least a year, but already 6 months later, people were saying in the taverns that the prince, who was presented to the empress, had single-handedly defeated the monster near the capital. Everyone eagerly whispered among themselves and discussed that this was not the first time the prince had fought monsters. Astaroth looked at the prince with a satisfied smile and declared that she had not thought at all that he would cope in just 6 months. He looked at her confusedly and stated that she had said earlier that she wanted the monster cores. He also said that he wanted to make sure she ate them all. He presented her with the kernels and declared that he would watch until she swallowed the whole thing. Astaroth agreed with him and began to absorb. She determinedly ignored the gaze, which grew more intense with each passing day. Time flew by very quickly, while the empress was busy with her daily affairs. She sighed heavily and asked the maid if this was the first painting Meryem had ever completed. Charlotte smiled and said that it was. Charlotte asked with a smile if it wasn't a beautiful picture in front of them. Astaroth stared at the painting for a while, not knowing how to describe her feelings. On a beautiful bright day, she and her companion were on a picnic. She looked at his beautiful face with joy, and at the same time she behaved carefree. He smiled and flirtatiously flirted with the beautiful empress, while a cheerful smile never left her beautiful face. She knew perfectly well that she had to give up all her desires for him to live. Miriam looked at the empress's assistant with surprise and menace, and asked what he was talking about. Pavel looked at the young man with a smile, and stated that the empress had told him not to bring monster cores anymore. The prince was shocked because he knew that she had not yet fully recovered her strength. He pushed the empress's assistant away and declared that he would talk to her directly. Pavel told the fleeing prince that the empress had forbidden any future meetings. The prince was devastated and did not understand why she suddenly decided to reject him. Astaroth refused the magic core, but the prince continued to bring her stones. They never spoke to each other directly, but she was simply hugging a bomb that could explode at any moment. Several years have passed since that moment. All the while, the empress's palace has been steadily increasing its power, but now it does not dare to tell the empress to retreat. The number of times the emperor appeared with the empress at banquets increased, and along with his interest, the increase in the saint's public naturally waned. But the saint's supporters remained as strong as before. It was because of the disasters that she could stop that she remained in power. The mysterious villainess who appeared one day several years ago, a woman who was said to destroy villages without a word and then leave, shrouded in demonic energy and wielding incredible magic. People began to call her the Devil's Bride. After her arrival, all the villages were destroyed to smithereens. But the saint appeared and restored the damage with her holy power. And so the fierce political battle between the saint and the empress continued. One fine hot summer day, Vina was running around the village, handing out leaflets to everyone with new news. After all, the empress was choosing her lover, and citizenship and title were not taken into account in this choice. He shouted that there was one condition, and this beauty, everyone was extremely surprised. At the same time, they were extremely outraged that it was a married woman who was introducing herself and at the same time taking a lover. But they also knew that the emperor was the first to have an affair with a saint. Derek watched everything that was happening from afar. Some time later, the empress, going about her business, was reading a newspaper. She was glad that public opinion was positive, as she had already given it. However, there was a small problem. She asked the knight if the knights had returned from the expedition. He smiled and stated that they had, and asked if he should bring them to the training ground. Astaroth said that they must be very exhausted from the demonic beast subjugation, and she should at least see them. She had not met the prince privately since that day 3 years ago, so today was the day of their meeting. She knew perfectly well that they would inevitably run into each other in public places. With the overwhelming support of the other knights, the prince became the captain of the Knights of Astaroth. For this reason, she could not avoid meeting him at official events where the knights were to attend. She knew that today, on the day of the return ceremony, she would meet him face to face. After some time, she finally met him, and despite his exhausted appearance, he looked great. She saw the long, thin eyes that softened when he looked at her. She saw the gentle look that froze between them. All the things that made up the prince, the man she valued. Meryem called out to the empress with embarrassment, but she looked away from him and greeted him, stating that they had worked hard. She said that she was really pleased to see that they did not neglect their training even after returning from a long expedition. For this reason, she wanted to hold a banquet. After some time, the empress sat quietly in her room, because it was simply killing her. She couldn't bear the prince's gaze, because it was so obvious that she had to run away. A moment later, she was taken aback as she heard her comrade's voice. Pavel said with a smile that they had arrived at the banquet hall, but she was no longer there, so they decided to go looking for her. Pavel stated with a smile that they had sent out word to everyone who had passed the first stage of the lovers' selection. They had also completed the background checks of the merchants who would be placed on the deck, and they had also distributed costumes to the actors. Pavel said with a smile that everything was going very smoothly. Charlotte said they had also drawn up a list of bodyguards who would go undercover on the cruise ship. The empress took the documents, and at that very moment was taken aback. She was shocked because she saw Miriam on the list. She stated that she had previously said to remove him from the lists. Charlotte said that she simply could not do such a thing, because there would be men there, of all classes and nationalities, so they did not know what could happen. Charlotte had said that everything would take place on the ship, not on land, and they simply could not let the greatest weapon of their empire go to waste. She knew perfectly well that the empress was avoiding the prince, but it was a question of her safety. Charlotte could not accompany, and the bureau denied personally, so she wanted him to be on the ship. The empress sighed heavily, as she realized that she would not be able to convince the girl. She looked at them intently and stated that, since they insisted on it, she simply had no choice. They looked at her with a smile, as they were glad that she agreed. Charlotte thanked the empress with a smile for having indulged her insolence so much. Some time later, Astaroth was left alone with her thoughts. Unfortunately, she hadn't been able to find someone to love in the past few years, so now she was busy choosing a lover, as her subordinate had planned. She understood that this was truly her last chance. It was hard for her because she couldn't find anyone to love, but at the same time, she was worried that she would have to kill the man she loved. Meanwhile, the young prince fought the monsters without wasting a single minute. He knew very well that humans were weaker than demonic beasts. At the same time, he was burning with anger and fury, because he simply could not understand how she had frivolously decided to bring a stranger into her house. Meryem understood that if she needed a lover, he could play this role. Meryem believed that she rejected him because she was already married to the emperor. He knew that if this was the official reason, he would have endured it and continued to be with her. He knew how much she adored him. He saw that she acted as if she was giving him everything. But at some point, he was driven into a dead end and told that she no longer needed him. He understood that despite everything, she had cruelly rejected him. The Spirit King looked at him in surprise and asked if he had really taken out his anger on the beasts. He had previously told the prince that the Empress was a demon. The prince sighed heavily and declared that he did not care if the Empress was a demon, since in that case it was just another word to describe the creature he desired. The next day, a meeting was held in the Imperial Conference Hall, and the Emperor stated that he had heard that the Empress's knights had received enormous support from the people. He said that the approval rating of the Holy Knights U was falling every day. He wanted to know the reason for the fall. Looking at his subordinate, he stated that the Empress's knights concentrated on small territories and villages, unlike the Holy Knights who only visited wealthy domains. The Emperor said that he simply had no excuse, and now he intended to take measures so that from now on they would visit smaller territories. The man stated that there was another problem. The neighboring empire had been steadily strengthening its pupil army over the past few years, under the pretext of demonic beasts. The man stated that this was true because the prince had come of age and was now hunting demonic beasts himself. They asked the emperor whether he was the main reason for the empress's growing influence. Miriam, the man who single-handedly broke into the nest of a demonic beast and destroyed the alpha and its cubs. Under his command, the knights diligently subdued the beasts throughout the empire. As a result of this, it was only natural that the influence of the Holy Knights of the Crusade began to wane. The emperor asked everyone present if they really wanted him to send it back. They understood that any excuse would do, but they still blamed the young prince. They said that she had committed such a shameless act because she was having fun with a boy, and they asked the emperor whether he really intended to allow such a thing. The emperor stated that, according to the traditional laws of the empire, both the emperor and the empress could take as many spouses as they wished, without limitation. He asked what law they wanted him to use to ban something like this. The man looked at the cameraman intently and stated that they had to break the empress's wings and then pick her up, and it didn't matter if it required a certain amount of force. They said that she would abandon such thoughts once they made a crown prince. Enrique sighed heavily, as everything was tiring him out. He understood that it didn't matter at all who the empress met with, since it didn't concern him. The man said he would find someone who could infiltrate the cruise ship, which was intended for the selection of lovers. The emperor declared that this was not necessary. After all, he himself intended to get in there. Everyone present was shocked to hear something similar. The time passed very turbulently, and so the day of the selection of the empress's lovers arrived. The empress looked intently at everyone present and declared that before them were knights who would guard them. She showed them the corresponding badges on the knights' chests and stated that if they had any problems, they should ask them for protection. The girls unanimously agreed with her. In front of her are the actors who were supposed to play the role of the empress on the cruise liner. There were 365 candidates participating in the selection process. She understood that if she had to deal with that many candidates alone, a fight could start, which would put her in danger. For this reason, she hired 12 actresses who were reliant on her. For the past month, they have been living secretly in the Empress's palace, and in doing so, they have mastered her manner of speaking to perfection. As the Empress's substitutes, they had to use their eyes and ears to observe and evaluate the candidates. Of course, the candidates would have no way of knowing whether they had spoken to the real Empress or not. After all, everything that happened on the ship will be nothing more than a Midsummer Night's Dream. After some time, the young lady informed the Empress that she had brought her the goods that she had previously requested. Astaroth praised her assistant. At the same time, the girl asked if the Empress really intended to wear something like that. Astaroth noted with a smile that this was unexpected. Charlotte was shocked and said that the Empress was a noble person and she was not meant to wear such clothes. Astaroth said with a smile that she would be careful and therefore there would be no problems. A moment later, she transformed into a different form. After some time, they were known to be observing the ship on which the selection was to take place. He noticed that she was really giving it her all, while some of them were straining themselves. He looked at his bride with a smile and asked her to get ready, because when the selection was completed, their world would begin. She looked at Lord Vellefort with a smile and agreed with him. The candidates for the role of favorite were mostly commoners or rural nobles. None of them had ever seen the Empress in person, so no one would be able to recognize her, even the maids or the knights of the Empress's palace. But she knew that only one person would be able to recognize her. Astaroth knew perfectly well that if the prince interfered, she would never be able to find someone worth loving. Pavel asked the empress with a smile if they couldn't just eat him. She looked at him in bewilderment, but he stated that she didn't need to play dumb. After all, he was just talking about that guy from the desert. Looking at the empress, he stated that, alas, lately the prince had such a look in their eyes as if he was begging to be killed, or he looked as if he wanted someone to eat him. He stated that she also liked the prince and that she could have a passionate affair if she demanded his heart as a condition of the contract. He would simply give it to her. Astaroth sighed heavily and stated that this was precisely the reason she did not want such a thing, because she was not looking for loyalty at all. And besides, he was still a child. Pavel did not agree with her, since the prince was full of vital energy, and he was already quite old. A moment later, they were informed that the ship was about to sail, and if anyone else intended to board the ship, they must do so immediately. She stated that she just needed a suitable partner, and Pavel said with a smile that he would do everything for her. Pavel looked closely at his mistress and stated that she seemed to be genuinely troubled by the thought of killing the child. He wondered if this was because the prince was truly in love with her. Pavel did not understand why she suffered so much because of him, and yet the empress could not answer him. He said with a smile that there is nothing scary about love. Pavel said that at first it seemed to the person that he could die from happiness, but such love always faded over time. He said that it was all because people didn't change, unlike demons, and that's what made them beautiful. He sighed heavily and stated that, unfortunately, human feelings are short-lived. She agreed with him, as she had experienced something similar. After some time, they boarded the ship. Pavel bowed with a smile and called the empress. He said with a smile that he really hoped she would have a summer night literally saturated with love. Astaroth looked at him with a satisfied smile, but did not answer. Love is like a summer night that was supposed to unfold over the course of a week, just beginning, on a beautiful cruise ship. After some time, the young people greeted the empress with smiles. At the same time, there were already actresses on the ship who played the role of the empress. All candidates for the title of favorite were obsessed with finding the real empress. They searched everywhere and looked closely at every lady. But the smarter ones were watching not the empresses, but someone else. The commander of the order, reporting directly to the empress, the one responsible for the safety of the cruise for the next week. Miriam understood that everyone present believed that the one he was friends with was the best and the real empress. He knew they shouldn't even try to find the real empress, as at worst, he would deal with them very quickly. Miriam approached the empress and asked her how she liked the food. She smiled and declared that everything was quite good. After their little conversation, all the young people pounced on the empress. A moment later, he asked his spirit to make sure that no one felt his absence. Then the spirit enveloped him with its magical power. He left in a hurry because the empress was not in the ballroom. He wanted to know where she really was. At the same time, he assumed the worst, that she didn't even board the cruise ship. The Spirit King stated that he could find her if he used his power. Miriam thanked him for his help, but refused. The king saw his comrade was stubborn. The prince merely stated that everyone was trying to find the real empress. They were so fair that they didn't even provide him, the head of security, with any information. Miriam, in turn, intended to find her with the help of his power before others. He knew that when the time came, she would have no choice but to accept him. He knew that the person she needed most was always there for her. He knew she would never find another man like him. Miriam, in turn, understood that he needed to find the unique magical scent that emanated only from the empress. That scent that grew stronger every time she used the magic stones. After some time of searching, he finally found his target. But he was taken aback when he came closer to her and noticed that she was in a different form. He noticed the beautiful eyes of the empress, and also noticed that someone touched her. Miriam became furious when she saw the young man pushing at the empress. Some time ago, the empress went out on deck and felt a pleasant wind. Unfortunately, she had not felt free for a long time. As she expected, no one paid attention to the black-haired maid. She knew she could relax and look at all the candidates, but to her surprise, as she walked along the deck, she bumped into a young man. He looked at her with contempt, and in doing so, he insulted her. Astaroth, in turn, decided to ignore him since he had a terrible character, but the young man pressed her and said that she should apologize for what she had done. Every morning, they would select a person who did not fit the role of a lover. And the criteria, the exception was her judgment. And as soon as she marked a person with her magic, her assistant would send him away. So at that very moment, she marked him. He stated with a smirk that she was very cute, and once he became the Empress's lover, they could meet her. Astaroth casually said that he should get out. The young man became furious, and at the same moment, he did not swing at her, as he intended to hit her in response to her insolence. But to his regret, he was unable to do anything as he was hit from behind. Astaroth froze in place for a moment as she was surprised by everything that was happening. At that moment, she saw the captain of the knights, who was angry. She did not understand how he knew where to go, and at the same time, she wondered if he recognized her. The prince came closer to the Empress and asked if she was okay. Astaroth was taken aback and, looking away, declared that she was fine. At the same time, she wondered if he didn't recognize her. At that very moment, she began to rejoice at how perfect her disguise was. Miriam, in turn, was taken aback and looked at the Empress in surprise, as he assumed that this disguise was her idea. When she was the Empress, she had pushed him away, but he didn't mind that she was now walking around in the guise of a servant. He understood that he should just play along with her. At that very moment, the prince came closer to her and asked her name. She was taken aback, as she did not expect this, and began to mumble something. At that very moment, the young man came closer to her and shared his energy. Miriam, with a satisfied smile, exchanged the young maid and declared that she would take care of him that evening. She was taken aback for a moment, as she had not expected such a thing. After some time, they were walking happily along the deck. Astaroth, looking at the prince, asked if she really needed to serve him. Unfortunately, she was not used to being so polite. He asked with a smile if she had expected anything else. She was surprised, as they were just walking along the deck and chatting happily. The prince bought her a treat. A moment later, she was happily enjoying the wonderful food. She realized that street food was truly the greatest culinary culture ever invented by humans. Astaroth looked at the prince with a smile and offered him a treat. He saw the juice from the treat running down her hand, and at that very moment, he began to flirt lightly. Astaroth froze for a moment in embarrassment, as she had not expected such a thing from him. For a moment, frozen in shock, she looked at the prince, who tenderly licked the juice from her hands. After the process was completed, she was taken aback and pulled away from him, while she sheepishly stated that the potatoes were very tasty. Astaroth stepped away from the prince and wondered if he had always been like this. She didn't understand when he had time to grow up. A moment later, he asked her to wait a little, as he felt he was being followed. Astaroth looked closely at the prince, as she realized that he had noticed the men who had been following them for a long time. She assumed that they were assassins who disguised themselves as concubines to kill her. She had no idea who sent them. At that very moment, the prince summoned the Spirit King. In the past, the power of the Spirit King served only to cool the young energy that the prince possessed. His young body was inhabited by an incredible, powerful force, so it had to be suppressed by the energy of water. But as time went on, his body finally became strong enough to contain the power of the sun, and for this reason, he could control the Spirit King. Also, the Spirit King no longer needed to control his power to suppress the prince's energy. For this reason, he dealt with the hired killers with ease. She was surprised, because he handled this kind of cleaning with ease. She realized that he had truly become quite an adult. For a moment, all her thoughts vanished as she heard a noise, and a moment later, she felt a disgusting magic, and then she saw the bodies of the dead rushing towards her. The prince was shocked by this, but he could not resist and rushed to her, calling her by name. She stood there for a moment, stunned, as the corpses ran towards her. Astaroth, in turn, realized that Belaifor had finally shown up. Miriam was furious and almost went crazy last time. He smelled the beautiful scent of the Empress, and yet he realized that the special scent had been wasted on the vile young man. He understood that she had ignored him for the last few years, and now that she had hidden her identity, she was hanging out, spending time with him. He was furious that she had pushed him away, but he saw how she looked after him. For this reason, he softened, because he never thought that she would behave so nicely with him. At the same time, he flirted with her a little. Looking at his companion, he realized that he simply could not be angry with her. Then he said with a smile that she shouldn't look at him like that, since the food was hot and he just wanted to cool it down. He knew what she had named the ship, and he knew it was a dream he had been imagining every day since the day she had rejected him. He just wanted to grab her and stop time. He understood that this was a dream from which he did not want to wake up. Meryem wanted to ask why she left him, but a moment later, all his thoughts disappeared, as something unexpected happened to them. He didn't know what he had to do to make her accept him again. Every time he saw young people laughing around her at banquets, he wanted to incinerate them. He sighed as he couldn't control his emotions and knew he needed to end the role-playing game, so he called her. But when the prince turned his attention to the empress, he was momentarily taken aback, as he saw that monsters were rushing towards her. Belai for the arrogant demon whom she had to discipline the most. It was the brother who hated her more than anyone in the world. She could smell her brother, which came from the monsters. She was surprised that he didn't attack her directly and found a contractor. Astaroth was even more surprised when the prince covered her with his body. At that very moment, the prince used his magic and stopped the creatures. The Spirit King was puzzled, because he did not understand how this could happen, since the monsters were dead. The prince closed the empress's eyes and declared that she did not need to look at such an abomination, and he suggested that she leave. The prince called the empress by name, and she looked at him with a smile, because she had been caught. She wanted to know when he revealed her. The prince looked at her with confusion and stated that he knew her true nature from the very beginning. Some time later, they stood quietly on the deck. Astaroth broke their silence and stated that the prince's skills had improved. He didn't answer her, and again there was dead silence between them. After 3 years, it seemed awkward to have a normal conversation, yet she couldn't ignore the child who had rushed to save her. Astaroth tenderly stated that he had matured while she had not seen him, because he had become stronger and could use his power. The prince looked at her coquettishly and asked if she could give him a goodnight kiss. She looked at him with a smile as she noticed that in some ways he had not changed, so she stated that now was not the time to sleep. Then the prince came closer to her and kissed her tenderly, and in doing so, he transferred his power to her. He continued kissing her. Astaroth was taken aback for a moment, as she realized that her assistant was right. As she saw that the boy who had previously been embarrassed by one kiss had disappeared, he sighed and declared that he would always recognize her, no matter where she was or in what form. He said that if she intended to choose a lover for herself, she should do it in front of him. He asked how many people she wanted to choose. He wanted to be close to her, so he unconsciously released his power. Astaroth looked intently at the prince, because she wanted to give him everything possible. At that very moment, the prince kissed her hand and tenderly asked why she had avoided him. He looked away from her in embarrassment and stated that if she couldn't tell him why she was avoiding him, he wouldn't be able to accept it. Astaroth, in turn, looked at him with sadness, and then she declared that when they got off the ship, she would tell him everything. He was taken aback because he didn't expect this. She knew that he had stubbornly held her back when she had run away from him, and in the end, he had forced her to appear before him. Perhaps because of his straightforwardness, he never took shortcuts and always met everything head-on. But she was different, and she just couldn't kill him. She knew it would be right to send him away before everything happened, so she wanted to get off the ship and deal with him. She intended to send him back to his homeland, because she knew that this was the best thing she could do for him. At that very moment, the prince grabbed her hand and declared that he would even go and catch the demon. He shouted that if she needed a monster core to recover, he could give it to her, but in one situation, a demon core would be more suitable for her. She looked at him in bewilderment, but at that very moment, he declared that the killers were sent by a demon. Astaroth stared at the young man, as he was more dazzling to her in the summer than the scorching sun. He stated that he would at least offer the demon core as a courting gift. He wanted her to let him love her. Only then did she realize her mistake, because his summer was bright, shining, and absorbing all the rest of the year. She forgot that by locking her inside the eternal summer, he made it impossible for her to see anything but him. She knew she had to become a demon and throw him away right now. But before she could even utter a word, he declared that he loved her. Astaroth, in turn, froze for a moment, as at that very moment she accepted him. Astaroth could not stand it, and hugged the prince tightly, with tears in her eyes. For some time the young prince tenderly embraced his companion, while he saw how the emperor watched them from afar. Meryem, in turn, looked at the emperor with restrained rage, since he had no intention of giving the empress to him. The next day, Pavel smiled and told the lady that she didn't need to worry, because he saw that the candidate's appearance was mediocre, so they could only settle down, lacking talent and skill. He shouted with a smile that the lady should leave everything to him, and at that very moment, he ran away in a hurry. At that very moment, she remembered the prince who had left her. She knew he looked like he didn't want to leave her side. Not even for a second. But as the cruise ship's head of security, he had no choice. She couldn't stop him from loving her, and she found it difficult to completely suppress her own feelings. For this reason, she knew she had to find a partner she could love enough to kill. She knew the demon had sent her a small gift, and it was a small thing, but she assumed the death threats would continue today as well. Astaroth, in turn, wondered if there was a good way to find the right person. A few minutes later, she saw young people talking to each other and discussing where the real empress was. Astaroth glanced sideways at the young people, and at that very moment used her magic and marked them as something she did not like at all. But at that very moment, she was taken aback as she heard someone's beautiful voice. She froze and blushed at the man, as she saw a handsome young man. She stared at him, wondering if there really was a candidate on the list who looked so innocent. He approached the young people and declared that they should apologize to the lady personally. Astaroth understood that the scum had lost their spirit. She saw how they hesitated. Astaroth looked closely at the young man, as she realized that he had lived as the top predator since birth. And yet it was he who brought danger to them. At that very moment, the young man pushed him away and declared that such a thing did not concern him, and they hurried away. He noticed that it was rude of them, and without wasting a minute, he used his magic. At that very moment, the young people were floating in the air, enveloped in magic. Astaroth noticed that he was wonderful, for the manifestation of magic, even without a spell, was proof that he had already reached the kingdom of the monarch. The wizards of this era were nothing more than swindlers and cunning deceivers. Causality allowed true magic and the existence of only one bloodline, and they were called by many names, the successors of the forgotten era of the guardians of magic, or the descendants of dragons. And in the current era, there was only one person who could be called by such a name. From the Grand Duchy of Silverrose protecting the north of the empire, Shiloh Ilverose, Astaroth immediately looked at the young man with embarrassment, as she realized that she had finally found him, the one she could fall in love with. He looked at her with a smile and asked if she was surprised. Astaroth asked, with the same smile, if she should really be surprised. He asked if she was afraid of him as he used the unknown power. Astaroth said with a smile that it was mesmerizingly still and beautiful. She smiled and said that she had not seen such beautiful magic for a long time. She praised his wonderful magic and said that she liked it. But the young man was extremely surprised, as he did not expect to hear such a thing at all. He froze in embarrassment and asked if she had really seen through the essence of magic. He was shocked and amazed because she was the first person who saw his magic. She looked at him in surprise, as this was an extremely amazing coincidence. He stated that he had no other relatives who knew how to use magic, because his father died early and his mother did not know how to use magic. The magic that was supposed to disappear from this world remained without a trace in the family of Silver Cargo, just as the desert and chalk packed up relatives of the sun. The north of the empire needed a lineage of equal weight, that is, causality, universal rules that did not allow the balance of the world to be discovered, so that, technically speaking, Miriam and the young man are like two sides of a mirror. At that very moment, the young man introduced himself and stated that his name was Shiloh. Irsi. Looking at the young maid, he asked her name. Astaroth stated that her name was Arti. He smiled and said that her name was excellent. Astaroth wondered if the young man was in cahoots with the demon, or if he was trying to use a honey trap against her. Shiloh said with a smile that it was time for lunch, so he invited her to have lunch together. She said that she was only a servant and therefore could not accept his offer because their statuses were different. Then the young man looked at her in surprise and said with a smile that being a maid was an excellent profession. But he also asked what status had to do with eating. She timidly looked at his outstretched hand, as she did not know how to refuse him. She couldn't say that he didn't care about our status when he dealt with young people. Previously, he clearly gave the impression of a man who knew his superiority. The Empress, nevertheless, accepted his invitation. After some time, she looked in surprise at the beautiful table, as he ordered too much food, while he stated that he was just a hungry man. Shiloh fed his companion with a smile, and the lady did not refuse him, and ate the food with pleasure. Unfortunately, she knew that there was not much information about the Grand Duke. If he was part of the empire in the north, This is an autonomous domain. They themselves organize taxes, without managing them in the imperial palace. Except for major events such as coronations, they never descended on the capital. They never interfered in central politics, and they refused all requests for help unless it was a national crisis. Because they possessed an incomprehensible power of magic, they could not be forced by the military power of the world, where even the emperor treated them as if they did not exist. In other words, in front of her sat the handsome one, practically the king of the north. Shiloh asked with a smile what desserts she liked, because he wanted to know everything. Astaroth saw that he spoke beautifully, and, on the other hand, he was not at all offended by the fact that she hardly treated him with respect. She said with a smile that the north was far away, so she wanted to know how he ended up in such a place. He thought for a moment and stated that the sirens he had recently observed had disappeared. Sirens are monsters that lured people into the sea with songs and then devoured them, as their habitat is the sea, making them difficult for ordinary people to deal with. He asked with a smile if it wasn't strange that an entire column had disappeared. She knew that the column was a group of 50 or 100 monsters, following with their only leader. He stated that from tracking their course, it seemed that they would arrive at the sea in a few days, and it was very urgent, so he immediately went to the imperial palace. He also told the lady that he heard the emperor was on a cruise ship. The young lady froze in shock. She did not expect to hear that the emperor himself would be on the ship. She didn't know how he got inside, but she knew that if he had used divine power, it was no wonder her assistant hadn't noticed. The duke said with a smile that at first he was nervous, but then he met the lady as if by magic. She asked in surprise whether it was acceptable to divulge such information to a simple maid. He smiled and stated that he was a great duke who had come to exterminate the siren colony. She knew that the number of monsters had grown. She didn't expect that he would simply leave the north for the likes of them. Shiloh looked at the lady and stated that he was just trying to impress right now. He smiled and said that he was a very strong man. She understood that he had a very interesting character. For this reason, he would be loved everywhere, because it seemed to her that he had received only love since birth. So she understood that he was the complete opposite of the young prince, who never slept peacefully until she took him in. She became convinced that this was an inevitable law of balance, but it left a bitter taste. A moment later, he announced that he would wait for her on deck the following morning. He ostentatiously kissed her hand and stated that she could go out if she wanted to see him. He smiled and said that he was very curious to know everything about her, and he, in turn, really hoped that she would also be interested in him. She was shocked, wondering if all men from the north were like this, because she liked him so much, to the point of absurdity. She wanted his passionate kisses. She wanted him to whisper words of love to her. She wanted to exchange superficial feelings with him. In the end, she could stab him straight in the heart, clutching the dagger in her hand. She understood that she could do something like this without killing the prince. Then she turned around and saw the prince in front of her, who was interested in what she was doing. After some time, the prince courted the empress. At the same time, she wondered why she felt like an unfaithful husband who was abandoning his devoted wife. She saw that he acted as if nothing had happened. He wanted to give her his attention, so she could not refuse him. She remembered the moment when he confessed his feelings to her. But until he confessed his feelings to her, she didn't feel guilty, dated him, and met other guys at parties. But now she felt awkward, for no reason at all. He called her, and she was taken aback, and she looked away from him in embarrassment. A moment later, the prince tenderly kissed her feet and declared that he had done everything. She smiled and asked if he meant that a swarm of sirens was approaching. She knew that the songs of the sirens bewitched people and made them drown in the sea, so they and all the members of the crew had to plug their ears with cotton wool. Even if the soldiers were used to sea battles, they still had to behave carefully. He stated that they would do everything if she wanted it. Astaroth, looking at the prince, said that he needed to look at his eyes when they talked. He looked away from her in embarrassment and stated that he didn't want this now. Then he asked her if she could allow her heart to love him. At that very moment, his face changed, and he declared that he himself did not understand what was happening, since he wanted to take possession of her. At the same time, he was puzzled, because she did not stop other men, and he did not know why she did not allow him to participate in the selection. Miriam asked sheepishly if she really didn't need him anymore. She knew there was nothing she could do about the situation, so she declared that she needed to find the Siren Leader's magical core, the magical power that her Anna had felt recently, the reason why a completely normal colony of sirens had suddenly changed. She understood that it was the work of her demon comrade. She smiled and stated that if she went to them personally, they would offer their main part themselves, because it would be a great honor for them to complete it. Miriam was taken aback and asked in surprise if she really intended to go to see herself. He said that it was too dangerous. She looked at him with a smile and tenderly stated that this was the reason she needed his protection, as it had to be a core that was at least 100 years old. Looking the prince in the eyes, she declared that she needed him to stand up to her brother. He sighed heavily and stated that he had one condition. She wanted her to spend time with him tomorrow, because he assumed that they would not attack them tomorrow. The Empress looked at him in bewilderment, as she had not expected such a thing. At that very moment, she remembered how the Northern Duke had said that he would be on deck tomorrow. She said with a smile that she was ready to do something similar. Meryem asked if she understood him correctly, because he was inviting her on a date. She smiled and said that she was ready to go on a date with him. The young man was taken aback and immediately became embarrassed, as he did not expect her to agree so quickly. She lay on his shoulder and said with a smile that the ship was called A Midsummer Night's Dream. She knew that this was enough, because before they left the ship, she would tell him everything, and it would be a parting gift for him. She knew that now that she had a way to return to her original body, the prince would only suffer if he stayed near her, so she wanted to say goodbye to him on the ship. The next day, the young lady was slowly getting ready, knowing that the emperor was nowhere to be seen. She wanted to know why he had come on board the ship. She understood that if she could return to her original form, she would be able to fight back against the emperor. She wanted to return to her true form, as she was a demon and did not want to try to remain human. A moment later, she saw the young prince who came for her. Astaroth asked with a smile if he had really done his hair. The prince looked away from her with embarrassment and stated that the knights had helped him. He smiled and said that it was time for them to go, and Anna agreed with him. At the same time, the young duke stood on the deck and chose flowers, as he wanted to meet the young beautiful lady. Pavel shouted with a joyful smile that the competition would soon begin. He was smiling as he told me what gifts there would be at the end of the competition, and the lady noticed a teddy bear, which she didn't like at all. Pavel shouted with a smile that now they would bring out the targets. With the same smile, he announced all the conditions of the competition. The prince looked closely at his companion and said that she should inform him of the disrespect the men had shown towards her. She said with a smile that he need not worry, as they would be punished. Miriam said angrily that they must have done something he shouldn't hear about. At that moment, the Duke approached her with a smile and stated that he was also very interested and curious about what disrespectful act they had committed towards her. At that moment, he greeted her as a servant, but with a smile, apologized and called her Empress. Astaroth was puzzled, as she realized that he had heard her conversation with the prince and understood everything, while the young people looked menacingly at each other, feeling competition. Meryem pulled the Empress closer to him and declared that she had promised to give him today. He hated it when she said hello to other men while they were on dates. She was puzzled because she knew that her identity had been revealed and she couldn't just ignore it. While the Duke apologized with a guilty look for his rudeness yesterday, Astaroth said with a smile that there was no rudeness, and all his actions were funny. He was glad that these actions amused her. Astaroth was a little puzzled, as her companion looked menacingly at the Duke, while he tried to restrain himself from tearing him apart. Pavel asked with a joyful smile whether other participants would take part in the competition, since they already had one winner. The prince asked the Empress if she wanted a teddy bear. At that very moment, he declared that he would take the remaining darts. Pavel shouted with a joyful smile that he would immediately put out fresh apples. Shiloh asked the Empress if she had accidentally thought about him yesterday. She didn't answer. She just looked into the distance with a smile. He regretted that she had not thought of him, for he had spent the whole evening thinking about her. Miriam listened to him with fury because he was trying very hard not to deal with him on deck. A moment later, he looked furiously into the distance at all the targets. Without wasting a minute, he threw the dart, and with one swing it smashed all the apples. Pavel smiled and told the prince that he had incredible strength. He showed an excellent result, but the game was different, so he was disqualified. The Empress said his actions were impressive, but he was upset because he did not win a prize for her. Astaroth touched him tenderly and said with a smile that he should not be upset, because even if he won, there would be a dispute about justice. Then the Duke smiled and declared that it was now his turn. He winked playfully at the Empress and declared that he would win a prize for her. Pavel looked at the Duke with a smile, as he was surprised by the appearance of the mysterious man. At that very moment, the Duke took up his darts and prepared to strike. He immediately released several darts, using his strength. Astaroth was surprised as he used his magic, with the prince stating that it was a little trick on his part. After some time, he was congratulated on his victory. The Duke asked the host if he could leave the bear while the game was going on. Pavel smiled and said that he could do something like that. Then Pavel declared that they should move on to the next competition, and he called the commander. He said that this new competition involves tug of war, and victory went to the one who could move the commander at least one step. The prince was shocked by this. The prince asked the Duke if he was taking part in the competition, but the Duke said with a smile that he did not like brute force because he was sure that he would lose. Then the prince applied his power to his opponent, sending him flying into the air. Shiloh asked the Empress if he would come to her that evening to deliver a teddy bear. He also offered to have dinner with her, but she said that it would not work out that day, since she had already promised to spend time with the prince. Pavel announced the winner with a joyful smile. The Empress said that tomorrow would be the last day of the cruise, so she could have lunch with him. He was glad to hear this, because there were many candidates, so he was very nervous. Astaroth stated that since he had boarded the ship, he was also becoming a candidate for the role of her husband. She knew that he had come on board without permission, and therefore could tolerate everything else. He said with a smile that this was so, and he was genuinely flattered. In fact, he thought that he would die in their proud solitude. But on his way, he met a beautiful empress. He said that he was sincere when he wanted to meet her. If she chose him, after the selection was completed, he would gladly enter his empress's palace. She asked what about the north, but he stated that he could simply teleport back and forth when needed. He stated that he would be of great help to her. She understood that if he was on her side, then the other factions would also switch to her side. The Duke stated that he always received a message about what was happening in the capital, and therefore he knew that her actions were quite unusual. He knew that there were few empresses in history who had military power, since they were not knights, and knights bought with money would not swear allegiance. She looked closely at the Duke, as she realized that he already knew that she wanted to become emperor, since even her husband did not know about such a thing. She realized that he was very astute in politics. Then they began to talk about politics, and the Duke gave her some advice. After some time, he noticed something and asked the Empress if she could extend her hand to him for a moment. She looked at her hand in bewilderment as he was writing something on it with his finger. But at that very moment, she was taken aback as he reported that the Emperor was watching them right now. Astaroth felt relieved that Togo was upstairs, as he couldn't hear their conversation. The Duke looked intently at his companion and declared that he had a dream. It was a dream to raise real wizards like him. After all this time he was extremely lonely. She realized that no matter how he smiled, he was terribly lonely. For this reason, he opened his heart to her, because she knew magic. Shiloh said that the current emperor, who was a paladin, would never grant his request, and finding wizards only in the north was too difficult. The prince came closer to the Empress and hugged her tightly, and also asked what they were talking about. At the same time, the host announced that the tug of war was over and all participants had lost. Miriam stated that he envied the Duke because he communicated with the Empress. She looked at the Duke with a smile and said that for this reason they should continue their conversation on the last day. The Duke was a little offended by her words, as he wanted to spend time with her, but she understood that the prince would not allow such a thing. Miriam then closed her eyes and said that he would show her something better, so she should stop looking at him. Pavel, with a satisfied smile, declared that the Empress accepted men not only with their beautiful faces, but also with beautiful bodies. Pavel said, with a smile, that they should now undress. He shouted that if they were confident in themselves, they should show their figure. Astaroth, with a sly smile, declared that this competition would certainly be a delight for the eyes. The young people were taken aback, as they did not expect to hear such a thing. The Duke asked with a smile if she was really saying that the harness was what she liked. He stated that he would also participate in the competition, as he was looking forward to seeing how well they would suit their commander. She briefly imagined what he would look like in such a guise. She was very embarrassed. At that moment, the prince was taken aback. He didn't ask her if she really liked it. She said he didn't have to wear it, but he said he wanted to wear it. He looked at the empress with embarrassment and asked her to choose one suit for him. She was shocked by such a statement, as she did not expect such a thing from him. He drove her crazy with his actions, but she still agreed. After some time, they moved to a separate cabin. Some time ago, he said that he didn't know how to put on such things properly, so he asked her for help. Astaroth was shocked, and she didn't know where he learned such a sweet seduction technique. She said that they usually wore a shirt underneath, but there were no shirts of the right size. At the same time, the prince stated that he would simply wear something similar on bare skin. Astaroth was taken aback for a moment as she saw that his energy was enormous. Only its power, like fire in its properties, became even more intense with sudden changes in emotions, such as excitement or anger. She assumed that he was angry because of jealousy. Astaroth said he looked amazing. She came closer to him and, touching his body, said that she would take some of his energy. Then she began to absorb his energy. But she understood that such things were useless, because his power had become enormous, and her lifespan could increase thanks to him. She understood that she needed more intimate contact. He then stated that she should leave a mark that would indicate that it belonged to her. He sheepishly stated that she should leave a small mark with her lips right on his body. Astaroth was extremely confused by his statement. She recoiled from him and refused. There was a reason why she treated the request to dress him as just a cute request, because she knew how he felt, and because she had received his confession. For this reason, she was convinced that she must send him away from her. Maryam came closer to her and stated that he knew perfectly well that she was constantly looking for an opportunity to leave him. Maryam, with suppressed rage, said that she did not need to say that it was not true, and if she needed concubines for political reasons, he was better off approaching anyone on the ship. Maryam hugged the empress tightly and declared that she had pushed him away because she was afraid of falling in love with him. He said that she had arranged everything just to find a replacement for him. Taking off her wig, he asked her if he was wrong in his judgment. He said that if she was going to put someone in her husband's place, then she had better stop because he had no intention of giving up. He also stated that she should not send him away anywhere, since it was useless. She looked at him with tears in her eyes and asked if he was really ready to do anything, even if the result of her love was his death. She looked at him intently, wanting to know the answer, but she knew she shouldn't have said that. He smiled tenderly and stated that he and death had been acquainted since childhood. Astaroth looked away from him, her gaze filled with sorrow, and stated that she did not want to tell him because she knew that was how he would react. With tears in her eyes, she said that she didn't want him to die. He said she shouldn't misunderstand him, as he didn't plan to die immediately. He said there was a reason why the gods sent him the dagger, as well as her. He asked if there was a prophecy that demanded she love him and then kill him, why she fought so hard against the divine will. He wanted to know if she was looking for someone else to love and kill. She said she was. He looked at her menacingly and asked if she really thought that was called love. Astaroth pulled away from the young man and stated that she had to try something. Then the prince declared that he was the only one. He knew that people were dying, and he was not afraid of his end. She said that she just did not want his blood on her hands. He stated that if they lived together and she got tired of seeing him grow old, she could kill him, and then she could return to her rightful place because he would die contented. He wanted her to tell him everything, and at the same time, he wanted her to let him into her heart. She was in shock, but at the same time, she understood that he gave her hope to love. With tears in her eyes, she declared that she would not resist, and when she was overcome by desire, he must take her life. Maryam was surprised by her change, but still said that everything was fine, and she didn't need to worry. Maryam said with a smile that if she couldn't bring herself to do it, then he wouldn't give up easily either, and so she would have to work hard. He said they could play this game all their lives. Miriam said that she could meet with the Grand Duke if she wanted to. He kissed her on the spot and said that for every date with the Duke, she should meet with him in the same way. He stated that in the end, she would understand that she had to kill him. She was very confused because she had never heard anything like this before. A moment later, she pulled away from the young man As the competition had already begun, Miriam approached her tenderly, declaring that he was not opposed to being one of the lovers, as such arrangements were commonplace at night, while he was a quick learner and willing to do whatever it took to satisfy her as a hostage. That same evening, she stood on the deck, gazing into the distance and thinking about everything that had happened. Pavel ran up to the Empress and asked what she was doing. She did not answer his question, and only asked if all the passengers were in the banquet hall. He said with a smile that they were all in the banquet hall because he had mixed sleeping pills into the champagne, so everything was fine. A column of sirens was approaching them, and ordinary people were easily charmed by the song, so they decided to deafen the civilians in advance. The combatants plugged their ears with wet cotton wool while the prince tracked the location of the sirens. Only a week had passed, but for some reason it seemed to her that she had been on the ship for a whole month. Pavel asked the lady what had happened between her and the prince, since it was all written on her face. She sighed and said that nothing had happened, but in reality, everything was different. He smiled and said that she always had a weakness for cute things, and he was sure that the prince begged her not to leave him. She sighed and stated that if she had known he would grow up and try to eat her, she would have stayed away from him. Pavel asked if she had decided to take the easy way out. At that very moment, she shut her subordinate up, as she didn't want to talk to him anymore. But he only said with a smile that the prince was one of those people who could pursue her to hell if she asked him to do so. He realized that she was the only one who had not seen something like this. Pavel said with a smile that the young man was not himself, but he was still the true ruler of the Khan, and at the same time, he had royal blood. Pavel said with a smile that the prince showed her only what she wanted to see. He knew perfectly well that the young man would be able to do everything for her. Pavel said with a smile that it was time for him to go to the banquet hall because he simply could not miss the masquerade ball on the last night. After some time, the young empress was left alone on deck. She spent the fast thinking about the emperor since he still had not appeared before her. She wondered if he was simply observing and not saying a word, but she was surprised that he would leave his post for something like that. In the past, everything he did seemed sweet to her, but now he irritated her. Moments later, the Empress felt someone's magic. She looked away and saw the Duke, who presented her with a teddy bear with a smile. She was extremely surprised by this, as she did not expect anything like this. Shiloh smiled and said that he had come just in time. He said with a smile that this was the evening they were supposed to meet. He also stated that the masquerade was in full swing, so he asked if she could dance with him. Astaroth accepted his offer with a smile and asked what the situation was with the sirens. At that very moment, he told her everything. Astaroth handed him the bear and said that it would be better if he kept it. The Duke said with a smile that he would be very flattered if she hugged him in his sleep. A moment later, he used his magic on the Empress, and then she appeared before him in a completely different guise. She was quite similar to the transformation, but also noticed that with the help of magic, everything happened quite quickly. The Duke smiled and said that he would like to present her with some beautiful shoes. He looked at his companion with a smile and declared that they suited her perfectly. She noticed that he liked to hug her from head to toe. After some time, they finally came to the banquet hall. Everyone present was taken aback for a moment as they saw a beautiful lady. She froze for a moment as she assumed she had been caught red-handed. But on the other hand, she knew they would naturally suspect her, since she was glamorous and had appeared out of nowhere. They danced merrily, and she enjoyed every moment. She thought for a moment, since she had never taught the prince to dance. She knew she should try to teach him when they got back. The Duke looked closely at his companion and stated that it seemed she was thinking of someone else. He would ask for forgiveness, because for a moment he felt a little jealousy. Astaroth stated with a smile that it was not that she belonged to him, but that he belonged to her. Shiloh stated that this was indeed the case, while he wanted to be her loved one. Then she changed the subject and asked how he intended to deal with the sirens. He said that he was going to use wide-range attack magic. He wanted to show her his lightning magic. She asked in surprise if he was really going to strike lightning into the sea at random. He told him that it was so, because in this way he could strike a whole 100. She knew his plan was effective, but she had to go into the sea, and she knew she could get seriously hurt if she wasn't careful. He wondered why take the long way when there was a short way. She was taken aback for a moment and froze in place. At that very moment, she understood what the difference was between the Duke and the Prince. After all, the prince would never say anything like that. She sighed heavily and stated that she could not allow any casualties. He stated that he was well aware of his recklessness and that such sacrifices could tarnish her reputation, but he was simply too eager to show her his cold-blooded side. She sighed and declared that he was cool enough as is. He came closer to her and declared that he really wanted her to call him simply by his first name. At that moment, she pulled away from him and declared that if he finished this without a single casualty, she would finish it. Then she took off her disguise and gave the order to the soldiers not to let anyone out. The knight was taken aback, as he did not expect to see such a thing, but declared that he would immediately carry out her order. She knew that after a while the serial would approach them. Then the empress heard singing. After some time, she came out onto the deck to the prince and called him. He looked at her with confusion and stated that everything happened as she said. Because their songs did not act as sirens, they created a whirlpool. She smiled, and looking into the distance, asked if he knew the plan. She saw a creature from hell, but she knew that the man saw them in a different light. However, she thought about the amount of magical power. For this reason, the empress, without hesitation, threw herself into the sea, which she would soon receive.